Greetings and welcome. Tonight we embark on a journey far beyond the familiar. We leave behind our cities, our machinery, and the comforting luminescence of artificial light. Instead, we step into the stark expanse of the Stone Age, a realm where existence was never assured, and each day was a testament to resilience, tempered by apprehension, yet fueled by a flicker of hope. Take a moment to envision it, a small band of early humankind huddled close for mutual reassurance. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a darkness far deeper than we can readily comprehend. There are no walls to enclose them, no doors to secure, only the indistinct outlines of trees and the distant echoes of unseen creatures stirring. They have no way of knowing how long this encroaching night will feel, but one certainty remains. They must confront it, as they always have, armed with nothing but their intellect and the bond they share. This is not a historical account relayed from a safe distance. This is the unfolding chronicle of humanity's genesis. Before the refinement of implements, before the mastery of flame, and preceding the initial glimmers of organized society, there was an enduring spirit that carried our forebears through lean harvests, frigid nights, and every peril that lurked in the shadows. Therefore, if you are prepared, allow the clamor of the present to recede, set aside the relentless rhythm of clocks, and the perpetual hum of modern existence. We shall proceed with deliberate caution into an era where time was not measured by hours, but by the cycles of the sun, a period when mere survival was not a concept, but the sole and paramount objective. Before the advent of fire, our ancestral environment was profoundly different. The sun served as their solitary, dependable provider of illumination and warmth. When it vanished beyond the visible curve of the earth, the very character of the planet transformed. Darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was an impalpable entity, a substantial weight that pressed upon the edges of human perception. As night descended, so did the chill. Concurrently, the sounds of the untamed world intensified, and in that extended interval between twilight and dawn, survival necessitated a nightly negotiation with the natural world itself. Visualize yourself situated within that context. There are no artificial sources to push back the encroaching shadows, no gentle hum of electricity, and no reassuring glow emanating from a distant settlement. When the sun departs, it is utterly gone, leaving above an unbroken expanse of blackness. Stars pierce the void, sharp and frigid, offering no discernible warmth. The moon may cast its pallid radiance across the land, but its presence is unreliable, sometimes absent altogether, leaving only profound darkness. And within that darkness, every subtle rustle, every sharp snap of a twig served as a stark reminder that humankind was far from the sole sentient beings awake. Prior to fire, our ancestors depended entirely on their senses and on one another. Small congregations remained in close proximity. They quickly grasped the stark reality that a solitary human adrift in the night was effectively an invitation to predators. Lions, hyenas, and saber-toothed felines. These were not abstract fears, but immediate, tangible threats. To endure, humans congregated in substantial numbers. They slept in close proximity, not for comfort, but for enhanced security. A dozen pairs of eyes and ears provided a significant advantage over a single set, and in the absence of fire, constant alertness was their sole means of defense. In those nascent periods, apprehension was not a hindrance, but a vital instrument. Fear maintained their vigilance. Fear compelled them to seek refuge before the sun completed its descent. They utilized caves whenever they could locate them, not solely for protection from the elements, but because the solidity of stone walls offered a more defensible perimeter than open terrain. When caves were unavailable, they sought out natural depressions in the earth or dense thickets that could conceal their forms. While imperfect, it offered a measure of safety. The cold presented another unyielding adversary. We often forget, accustomed as we are to homes with blankets and heating, just how unforgiving a night could be without any source of warmth. Early humans donned whatever coverings they could procure. Animal pelts draped over their shoulders, rudimentary wrappings fashioned from whatever materials they could gather. They pressed their bodies together, sharing body heat. This was a practice driven not by preference, but by absolute necessity. To be isolated in the cold was to court certain death. Survival depended on maintaining proximity sufficient to perceive another heartbeat, and on the hope that the collective warmth of the group could hold the encroaching night at bay. Yet, even as they shivered in the gloom, they were learning that the Stone Age was not merely a period of peril. It was an era of continuous adaptation. Humans developed an exceptional aptitude for observing their surroundings and recognizing natural patterns. They learned which caves offered protection from prevailing winds. They learned to interpret animal behavior, to sense the proximity of danger, and to move with stealth when the darkness dictated it. In a world devoid of artificial light, their hearing became incredibly acute. The faintest crack of a branch could induce absolute stillness throughout the entire group. And then there were the celestial bodies. Long before humanity possessed any understanding of astronomy, they were intimately familiar with the stars. Not their names or their immense distances, but their unwavering consistency. The stars represented the only illumination that never faltered. They signaled to our ancestors the changing seasons, the opportune moments to relocate, and the migratory paths of prey. In the absence of fire, the heavens served as their silent cartographer, their temporal indicator, and their reminder that even within the profound darkness, an underlying order persisted. Food, naturally, constituted another nightly preoccupation. Without the means of cooking, their sustenance was limited to what could be consumed raw: plants, fruits, roots, and any flesh that could be dislodged from bone without preparation. This was not a diet of indulgence, but one of necessity. They learned to masticate tough fibrous materials, to fracture marrow bones with stones to extract the nutrient-rich fat, and to consume items that would elicit hesitation in us today. Every morsel held significance. Hunger was not an occasional discomfort, it was a perpetual companion. However, necessity has invariably been the impetus for innovation. The omnipresent darkness compelled early humans to establish routines. They foraged and hunted during daylight hours, racing against the fading sun to accumulate as much as possible. Before the world succumbed to blackness, they operated with a heightened efficiency, driven by an urgency that stemmed not from imposed discipline, but from primal instinct. As the sun began its descent, this urgency intensified. There was no allowance for procrastination. Those who lingered excessively in exposed areas learned the grave consequences of hesitation. Predators held dominion over the night, But humans possessed ingenuity. They devised strategies well before fire offered its assistance. They learned to ascend trees when threats drew too near. They recognized the advantage of remaining silent and motionless, of blending into the landscape rather than confronting danger directly. They understood that successful survival often depended on remaining entirely unseen. Nevertheless, even within this precarious existence, moments of tranquility did occur. When the group was safely concealed and the sounds of the wild receded into the distance, they would seek rest. Sleep was fragmented, shallow, and characterized by constant vigilance. One or two individuals remained awake, while the others closed their eyes. A rotational watch that continued until the first rays of dawn reappeared. During these hours, our ancestors laid the groundwork for collaboration. They relied upon each other out of sheer necessity. This interdependence, forged in the darkness, would ultimately evolve into one of humanity's most significant strengths. Nevertheless, there must have been nights of profound terror, nights when the scraping of claws against a cave entrance or the low growl of an unseen entity caused every breath to catch in their throats. They could do little but wait, clutching stones or sticks, hoping the threat would dissipate, and on occasion it did not. Survival was not a guaranteed outcome, and for every collective that persevered, numerous others perished. However, those who endured learned. Every narrowly averted catastrophe etched vital lessons into their collective memory. And these lessons were transmitted not initially through spoken language, but through behavior. Children observed, they mimicked, and over time, these ingrained instincts coalesced into tradition. Such was life prior to fire, a cycle of apprehension, deprivation, and unyielding adaptation. Yet, within that arduous struggle, something extraordinary was transpiring. The human intellect was undergoing a process of refinement. Every challenge demanded innovative solutions. Each night endured in the cold necessitated a novel approach to thinking. That relentless and unceasing pressure was gradually molding a species that would eventually master not only the endurance of darkness, but its complete eradication. When the initial sparks of fire emerged, they did not appear in a world poised for comfort. They materialized in an environment where every measure of warmth, every faint luminescence, was nothing short of a miraculous occurrence. Fire would not merely alter the nocturnal landscape, it would fundamentally transform the very essence of being human. Therefore, even before the glow of firelight pushed back the encroaching shadows, our ancestors had learned to coexist with them. They became keen observers of the night, silent scholars of the wilderness, beings who understood that, to persist, they must adapt. In those initial epochs, they did not conquer the world. They learned to endure it. And in doing so, they prepared themselves for the singular moment that would irrevocably reshape everything. For once the first flames ignited, and the night ceased to be an absolute dominion, all that preceded it would appear as a fundamentally different reality. The first instances of humans encountering fire were not instances of their own creation. It manifested from the heavens in the form of lightning strikes, or from the earth during periods of widespread forest conflagration. It was untamed, beyond control, and inherently perilous. Initially, it was something to be regarded with trepidation. The spectacle of flames consuming trees or spreading across grasslands must have instilled in our ancestors a dual sense of terror and profound wonder. They lacked the lexicon to describe it, no conceptual framework to grasp its true nature. However, they immediately comprehended one critical aspect. Nothing else within their observable world behaved in such a manner as fire. In its nascent stages, fire was an entity to be observed from a considerable distance. Yet, survival frequently hinges on innate curiosity. Over an extended period, that initial fear transmuted into something else entirely. Humans discovered that when the environment was ablaze, opportunities arose. Following the passage of the flames, they encountered roasted animal carcasses, which were far easier to consume and safer to ingest than raw meat. They observed that fire repelled predators that typically patrolled the periphery of their encampments, and they experienced a warmth that could penetrate the biting cold of the night. It is exceedingly difficult for us to fully appreciate the magnitude of this transformation. For hundreds of thousands of years, night represented an adversary. Darkness reigned supreme. The cold penetrated flesh and bone, and predators roamed without impediment. Then, one day, humans acquired the ability to transport fire, to sustain its existence rather than merely witnessing its ephemeral burn. They likely initiated this process by collecting glowing embers from natural fires, diligently protecting them and nourishing them with dry foliage and wood. It was an exceptionally fragile entity initially, susceptible to extinction as readily as it was born. Yet it proved sufficient. For the first time, the encroaching darkness encountered a boundary. Envision a small group congregated around one of these rudimentary fires. The flames danced and crackled, casting shifting patterns of light upon the cavern walls or the surrounding tree trunks. For the initial instance, the impenetrable void beyond their sanctuary was repelled. The biting cold was attenuated. The nocturnal sounds, the howls, the rustling, the snapping of branches, seemed more distant. The fire not only warmed their physical bodies, but also altered their internal state. The grip of fear loosened. Within the embrace of the fire, a sense of security prevailed. The advent of fire brought forth more than mere warmth and illumination. It became the inaugural, tangible instrument for shaping their world. Meat could be cooked, rendering it more digestible and significantly more nutritious. Roots and plants that were previously too tough or bitter became palatable. The human diet expanded, and with this expansion, our brains received the vital nourishment required for their growth. Fire, quite literally, provided us with the energy to transcend our previous limitations. Predators, once the undisputed rulers of the night, learned to fear its luminescence. A perimeter of fire served as a barrier that even the most audacious hunters rarely dared to breach. For the first time, humans were no longer entirely subservient to the whims of the wild. They could demarcate a territory, establishing a circle of light where their presence was exclusive. Within that circle, they were not merely surviving, they were commencing to claim a small dominion as their own. However, fire offered benefits extending beyond protection and sustenance. It fostered communal cohesion. In the distant past, when nightfall occurred and fire was absent, humans dispersed into whatever shelters they could find, huddling individually against the pervasive cold. Fire fundamentally altered this behavior. It established a focal point. Individuals congregated around it not only for warmth, but for companionship. They conversed, or in the absence of fully developed language, they communicated Through vocalizations and gestures, they shared food, they shared moments of silence, they shared a sense of security. In the proximity of the fire, they transcended their individual identities. They coalesced into a collective, bound not merely by necessity, but by a profound sense of connection. This marked the genesis of something more significant than mere survival. Firelight extended the functional day. Prior to its discovery, human activity was constrained by the availability of daylight. When darkness descended, the world effectively ceased to exist until the arrival of morning. But with fire, a new temporal dimension emerged. Hours were carved out of the night, during which narratives could be shared, tools could be honed, and plans could be formulated. Under that flickering radiance, the foundations of human culture began to take root. Over successive generations, our ancestors not only learned to guard fire, but also to create it. The discovery of methods to generate flames from stone or through friction must have been perceived as nothing short of miraculous. To strike two stones together and witness a spark, to rub wood until it produced smoke and then erupted into flame. This represented the attainment of control over a force previously considered purely elemental. It was a form of power, not measured in physical strength or speed, but in its capacity to alter the fundamental equilibrium between humanity and the natural world. Nevertheless, fire demanded respect. It was not a docile entity. An uncontained flame possessed the potential to incinerate shelters and displace entire groups from their dwellings. To maintain fire was to understand its nature, to feed it judiciously, and to observe it with unceasing attention. In numerous respects, those early humans were as much devoted servants to the flame as they were its masters. Yet, it was a service willingly rendered, as nothing else offered such substantial returns. The more humans utilized fire, the more it reshaped them. Cooked sustenance strengthened their bodies. Warmth facilitated survival in more temperate climates, enabling small bands to venture further into regions that would previously have been considered lethal. The darkness became less intimidating, and sleep less perilous as predators maintained a distance from its glow. Incrementally, fire transformed a vulnerable species into one capable of enduring virtually any environment. And during the tranquil hours illuminated by firelight, another phenomenon began to flourish. With fear subdued and hunger alleviated, the human mind found the latitude for contemplation. Perhaps it was within the shifting shadows cast upon cavern walls that the initial sparks of imagination were ignited. Observing the mesmerizing dance of flames remains captivating even today. For those early humans, it must have possessed an otherworldly quality. It is conceivable that during these extended fire-lit nights, the seeds of storytelling were sown, perhaps when an individual pointed to shapes in the shadows and imbued them with meaning. Even in the present era, there is an intrinsic quality to sitting in close proximity to a fire that feels predates articulated language. The crackling of burning wood, the gradual steady warmth, the way individuals gather in a circular formation and speak in hushed tones. It is an echo of the first monumental innovation that granted us dominion over the nocturnal hours. However, fire was not solely a benevolent gift. It also presented a challenge, one that necessitated both knowledge and self-control. Humans were required to learn how to locate dry wood, how to sustain a flame amidst wind and rain, and how to shield it from being extinguished. They had to transport it with them during their movements, carefully cradling glowing embers within bundles of bark or clay. A single misstep could result in a night devoid of warmth, security, or sustenance. Fire was a precious commodity that could be lost, and every group was acutely aware of the implications of such a loss. Nevertheless, those who mastered its utilization prospered. They began to explore more distant territories. They ventured into colder climes, confident in their ability to carry their own warmth. They learned to prepare not only meat but also plants, thereby unlocking food sources that had previously been inaccessible. They employed fire to harden wooden spears, enhancing their efficacy in the hunt. Gradually, fire transmuted humanity from potential prey into a considerably more formidable entity. And perhaps the most significant endowment that fire bestowed was time itself. With the aid of fire, humans could repel the pervasive darkness, extend their active hours, and congregate in ways previously unimaginable. They no longer succumbed to slumber the moment the sun vanished. They remained alert. They labored. They engaged in thought, evolving from beings merely reacting to their environment to becoming strategists, creators, and dreamers. The world prior to the advent of fire was characterized by apprehension, pervasive cold, and constant caution. The world that emerged after fire, while still fraught with danger, now possessed a defined boundary in the darkness, a circle of warmth and light where humans could convene and experience for the first time a diminished sense of insignificance. And within that circle, the subsequent pivotal advancements in survival awaited. Because with fire came not only enhanced safety, but also the opportunity to construct, to acquire knowledge, and to conceptualize further possibilities. Fire provided humanity with light and warmth. However, it was stone that furnished them with the capability to mold their surroundings through their own physical efforts. Long before the establishment of settlements, prior to the development of agriculture, and preceding the earliest indications of written communication, there existed stones that were chipped and sharpened with sufficient precision to enable cutting, crushing, and piercing. In those epochs, survival transcended mere avoidance of peril or the maintenance of body heat. It involved discovering methods to actively influence the environment rather than passively responding to it. And the nascent tools served as undeniable evidence that humans possess this very capacity. The earliest implements were rudimentary: a broken rock possessing a sharp edge, or a rounded stone weighty enough to shatter bone. These were not inventions in the contemporary sense, conceived with elaborate plans and detailed blueprints. They were discoveries. Perhaps an individual, through an accidental impact, struck two stones together and observed the resultant jagged edge. That edge could be utilized to sever flesh or to scrape hides. A moment of happenstance yielded a valuable lesson, and that lesson merited replication. Imagine one of those initial tools grasped in a human hand. It is heavy, irregular, and unrefined. Yet, for the individual holding it, it represented an unparalleled source of power. With that sharpened edge, they could more readily detach flesh from a carcass, cleave open bones to access the nutrient-rich marrow within, or sever tough plant fibers that would have been utterly unmanageable prior to its existence. The disparity between bare hands and a sharpened stone represented the difference between perpetual struggle and the nascent stages of gaining control. Over time, these stones underwent transformation. Early humans began to recognize that not all geological formations possessed identical properties. Some fractured cleanly, others dulled prematurely, and some shattered into useless fragments. Through a process of iterative experimentation, they discerned which types of stone proved most efficacious. Flint, obsidian, and chert were highly prized, not for their aesthetic qualities, but for their behavior when subjected to impact. A skillfully chipped flake could maintain an edge sharp enough to sever hide or wood. And that sharpness translated to reduced expenditure of time and effort, and consequently, greater food acquisition. These tools served purposes beyond the hunt. They were employed to meticulously clean animal hides, to cut them into shapes suitable for binding or wrapping to create garments. They were utilized to crack open nuts and to grind roots into a more digestible form. They shaped wood into functional implements, stripped bark to fashion cordage, and inscribed markings that may have represented the nascent stirrings of human cognition etched onto the material world. Each of these incremental actions, multiplied across countless generations, propelled humans further away from a state of mere survival and closer to actively shaping their own destinies. The craft of tool-making was not an innate instinct. It necessitated deliberate learning. Children observed their elders and emulated their actions, striking stones against one another until the correct auditory signal and the desired form emerged. Every flake of rock contained a pedagogical element. An incorrect angle resulted in an unusable fragment. The correct angle yielded a cutting edge capable of altering the outcome of a day's hunt. Proficiencies of this nature could not be committed to writing or stored in any medium other than memory. They were transmitted from one individual to another across successive generations, forming a continuum of knowledge as ancient as humanity itself. These tools fundamentally altered the methods of human predation. Prior to the advent of sharpened stones, scavenging constituted a significant aspect of their subsistence. Early humans frequently waited until larger predators had concluded their feeding before cautiously approaching to claim any remnants. A fractured femur yielded marrow. A discarded strip of meat represented sustenance. These fragments were vital for survival. However, with the introduction of stone tools, humans gained the ability to process carcasses with greater efficiency. They could cut more rapidly, transport larger quantities, and leave less for the opportunistic scavengers that followed in their wake. And thus, a gradual transition occurred from scavengers to active hunters. The initial implements were far from refined weaponry. They began as naught but sharpened sticks, occasionally hardened by flame, yet their efficacy multiplied immensely once tipped with keen lithic points. A simple wooden shaft could inflict a wound. A stone-tipped spear possessed the capacity to extinguish life. This transformation rendered sustenance acquisition less precarious. Small game yielded to larger quarry, and communities that once relied on serendipity now pursued their prey with deliberate precision. However, stone implements were not solely relegated to the hunt. They fundamentally reshaped every facet of existence. They facilitated the construction of more robust dwellings, the processing of tougher materials, and the defense of their territories against predatory threats. A sharpened stone affixed to a haft could mean the crucial distinction between repelling a predator and succumbing to it as a meal. In this context, tools transcended mere instruments. They became extensions of the human physique, akin to new teeth and claws forged from mineral and sheer resolve. The creation of these tools also necessitated a novel attribute: foresight. To fashion a cutting edge or sculpt a spear point, one had to visualize the finished product before its physical manifestation. This extended beyond mere survival instincts. It was the dawn of planning. The capacity to retain a concept mentally and subsequently manifest it in reality represented one of humanity's subtle yet profound revolutions. This singular progression from reactive existence to imaginative conception was as monumental as the discovery of fire itself. Concurrent with the advent of tools came collaboration. While an individual might shape a stone, entire communities benefited from the expertise of those adept at its craft. A proficient toolmaker garnered esteem comparable to that of a formidable hunter. One might be found at the periphery of the settlement, meticulously chipping away at flint, while others diligently procured food or prepared animal hides. In this manner, distinct roles began to emerge, and with these roles arose the nascent outlines of something far more significant than mere survival: society. Even in their rudimentary state, these stones contained the underlying blueprint for all that was to come. The process of chipping flint served as the precursor to engineering. The initial lithic spear point marked the genesis of the technology. Each implement represented a quiet declaration that humankind would not passively accept the world as it was, but would actively reshape it, incrementally. And as these tools improved, so too did the world inhabited by humans. With sharper blades, hides could be processed more cleanly, subsequently stitched together with sinew, and fashioned into garments that provided protection against the biting cold. With heavier stone mauls, bones could be fractured into fragments, yielding every last drop of nutrient-rich marrow. Through intricately chipped scrapers, wood could be expertly fashioned into handles and structural components for shelters. Survival evolved from a mere act of endurance to one of active shaping, adaptation, and mastery. Nevertheless, even with these advancements, existence remained challenging. A chipped stone edge failing at a critical juncture could signify the loss of a meal. A misdirected strike during a hunt might condemn the group to days of privation. Every tool, regardless of its sharpness or craftsmanship, was ultimately dependent on the proficiency of the hands wielding it. Consequently, humans engaged in persistent practice. They shaped stones not only out of immediate necessity, but because they intuitively understood, in a way that transcended explicit articulation, that preparation could be the decisive factor between life and demise. During those extended nights, illuminated by the campfire, with predators lurking just beyond the reach of its comforting glow, stones were meticulously molded into new forms. The resonant sound of flint striking flint echoed softly through the darkness, a rhythm as ancient as humanity itself. And with every emitted spark, every flaked chip, every sharpened edge, humankind etched a little more of its future into the fabric of existence. The transition from empty hands to hands, grasping stone, was not a singular occurrence. It was a protracted, arduous ascent built upon countless minor triumphs. Yet each stone bore a consistent message: humans We're learning not merely to endure the world, but to transform it, one deliberate strike at a time. And armed with tools, they stood prepared for the next significant challenge that would define their trajectory, the innate capacity for communication that would bind them together, elevating mere survival to a collective endeavor. A sharp stone grasped in the hand bestowed power upon humans, but it was language that empowered them to wield that power in concert. Prior to the advent of speech, survival was intrinsically limited to the immediate perceptions and actions of each individual. Yet, the world presented too many perils, and existence demanded too much for any single person to confront it in isolation. The ability to articulate ideas, to convey warnings of impending danger, to strategize hunts, or to offer mutual solace was not merely an advantage. It was the critical determinant between continued existence and inevitable oblivion. Initially, this communication did not resemble language as we understand it today. It was fundamentally sound, cries, grunts, and gestures that conveyed meaning long before the articulation of structured sentences. A raised hand might have signified imminent peril. A sharp vocalization could prompt the group to disperse and seek concealment. Over time, these vocalizations evolved to become more specific. A singular gesture or sound could denote not only the presence of a predator, but also its specific type and location. Each incremental refinement contributed to a greater certainty of survival. Envision a group moving with stealth across the open grasslands in pursuit of game. One hunter discerns a subtle movement in the distance, the faint silhouette of an animal etched against the horizon. Without resorting to words, communicating solely through rudimentary sounds and signs, he alerts his companions. They subtly adjust their positions, fanning out and assuming a state of readiness. There is no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. No one is left unassisted. What commenced as primal instinct has transformed into something far more profound, a shared system that solidifies the cohesion of the group. Language did not manifest instantaneously. It developed gradually, incrementally, propelled by the imperative of necessity. A solitary sound, employed with sufficient frequency, acquired augmented significance. A gesture, repeated consistently, became universally understood within the group. As children observed and mimicked, these signals were transmitted to subsequent generations until they ceased to require invention, existing intrinsically as an integral component of the very fabric of life. These nascent forms of communication transcended mere utility. They fostered trust. When an individual indicated the presence of sustenance or issued a warning of danger, and the group acted upon this information, resulting in their survival, the bond between them deepened. Each interaction reinforced a simple yet potent truth. Collectively, they possessed a security unattainable in isolation. This capacity for information sharing revolutionized the hunting process. An individual human, acting alone, could only stalk modest prey. Acting in concert, however, they could orchestrate coordinated efforts. One contingent could drive game animals towards another, or they could construct rudimentary traps, effectively block escape routes, and silently encircle their quarry until the opportune moment for attack. Language, even in its rudimentary and nascent form, transformed a disparate collection of individuals into a more unified entity. It also profoundly altered the manner in which humans cared for one another. A wounded hunter could articulate his discomfort or indicate the precise location of his injury. Those who remained to tend the fire could summon others back upon completion of food preparation. Infants and young children, incapable of self sufficiency, could be soothed and protected through sounds that conveyed reassurance. Language, in its most elementary manifestation, carried more than mere directives, it conveyed solace. Furthermore, language served purposes extending beyond immediate survival. It was the repository of memory. Prior to the development of language, knowledge was primarily acquired through direct action. One could learn by observing the process of stone knapping or hide preparation. However, there was no facile method for imparting instruction on alternative approaches. With the rudimentary beginnings of language, humans gained the ability to transmit accumulated experience. A single sound might signify the edibility of a particular plant or the inherent danger of a specific river crossing. Each utterance, each gesture, each shared signal functioned as a thread, binding the past to the present and ensuring that the lessons learned by one generation would endure within the next. From this emerged narrative, not in the sophisticated form we recognize today, with intricate plot lines and definitive conclusions, but as simple accounts shared around the communal fire. These were retellings of successful hunts or instances where danger was narrowly averted. These were not merely recollections, they were disguised instructions, serving as vehicles for imparting wisdom without formal instruction, and enabling knowledge to disseminate far beyond the reach of any single individual. With each communicative exchange, the human intellect became progressively sharper. Language demanded more than mere sound. It necessitated memory, the ability to form associations, and the faculty of imagination. To articulate concepts like there or later implied an understanding not only of the present moment, but of time and space as abstract constructs. In this manner, the relentless pursuit of survival was subtly molding the human brain into an instrument capable of far more than simply reacting to its environment. Even as language evolved, it was never entirely free of imperfections. Misunderstandings undoubtedly occurred. A signal conveyed in a moment of panic might be misinterpreted. A particular sound could possess one meaning within a given group and an entirely different significance within another. However, despite its inherent flaws, it functioned sufficiently to maintain human cohesion. And once bound by the efficacy of communication, their struggle for survival transformed from an individualistic endeavor into a shared undertaking. As the communal fires blazed throughout the night, language would have become progressively more nuanced. Within the warm glow of the flames, removed from the constant pressures of the hunt, there existed opportunities for communication beyond urgent signals. Sounds evolved into designations for objects. Both inanimate entities and specific locations acquired appellations. Across countless evenings, humans learned to transmute their scattered vocalizations into a rudimentary yet expanding lexicon. And in doing so, they began to forge a more profound connection with the world surrounding them. Language also conferred an unexpected capability, the ability to collectively imagine. Once two individuals could share a concept, they were empowered to plan not merely for the immediate present, but for the future. They could mentally rehearse a hunt before its commencement, collaboratively strategize methods for capturing an animal, or determine the optimal time for relocation as the seasons shifted. This represented a progression beyond instinct, embodying collaboration shaped by cognitive processes. And as language disseminated, so too did culture. Rituals and customary practices became more readily transferable. The prescribed methods for tool fabrication, wound dressing, or animal tracking could now be imparted, refined, and improved. What was once contingent upon direct imitation could now be explicated, adjusted, and shared. Language was not merely a tool for survival. It served as a form of collective memory, externalized within the vocalizations of the community. Even in contemporary times, traces of that ancient transition persist. When individuals converse, they are not merely exchanging data, they are participating in an unbroken, time honored practice that originated around nascent fires in the darkness, when a single sound could determine the outcome between life and death. Those inaugural utterances, however rudimentary they must have been, furnished humanity with an attribute unique among species: the capacity to thrive not as isolated individuals, but as a collective intelligence. From this foundation, all subsequent developments would arise. Yet in those formative epochs, it was comparatively simple: a cry to signal danger, a gesture to indicate sustenance, a sound to summon companions when the night grew unnervingly silent. Language commenced not as a sophisticated instrument for abstract thought, but as an essential lifeline. And in fulfilling this role, it evolved into one of the most potent forces shaping human history. Through words, even in their nascent forms, humans were no longer merely reacting to their environment, they were collectively shaping it. And soon, with their voices and their tools united, they would commence the process of domesticating a landscape that once appeared impossibly vast, seemingly beyond the possibility of human dominion. Possessing tools in their grasp and the rudimentary elements of language on their tongues, humans were prepared to confront the most persistent challenge of their existence: the procurement of sustenance. Hunger was a perpetual presence, dictating every decision, guiding every movement, and influencing every calculated risk. Without a reliable food supply, rest, security, and the prospect of a future were unattainable. The hunt and the harvest were not discrete activities, but rather two inseparable facets of a singular struggle, each demanding the entirety of early humans' capabilities. Hunting commenced long before humans attained proficiency in its execution. Initially, they were primarily scavengers, trailing larger predators and awaiting the abandonment of their kills. Armed with sharp stones, they could strip flesh from bones with greater celerity than competing scavengers. They also cracked these bones to access the marrow within, a rich source of fat and vital nutrients that other creatures could not readily obtain. This practice, though perilous, was remarkably astute. By learning to exploit what others discarded, humans managed to survive in a world that offered few second chances. However, scavenging could only sustain a limited number of individuals. As communities expanded and their tools became sharper, the focus of their efforts shifted. Small animals, birds, and reptiles constituted their initial targets. These hunts were often characterized by rapid, frenetic action, relying on swift strikes and unwavering persistence. The capture of a single rabbit could represent the crucial difference between enduring hunger and surviving another day. Over time, their hunting endeavors grew more audacious, Humans began to track larger animals, creatures that could nourish an entire group if successfully brought down, but could also inflict severe injury or death upon those who dared to confront them. It was in this context that cooperation became indispensable. A lone hunter was incapable of felling a deer or an antelope, but a coordinated group could effectively drive such prey into a prepared trap or corner it within a confined pass. They learned to strategically position themselves relative to the prevailing wind to avoid detection through scent. Silently, they would spread across the grasslands, herding their quarry towards waiting spear wielding individuals. Upon the successful conclusion of the hunt, the kill was swift and brutal, but it was followed by a profound sense of relief. Each successful hunt provided more than mere sustenance. It offered the assurance that their collective efforts and mutual trust had yielded tangible results. Hunting was not solely a testament to physical strength or courage. It demanded patience, acquired knowledge, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. Hunters became adept at deciphering tracks imprinted in the mud, following the subtle indications of broken branches, and recognizing the faintest scattering of droppings that might delineate an animal's path. They developed an understanding of seasonal cycles, knowing when herds would migrate and when their prey would be most vulnerable. Every hunt served as a rigorous test of observational skills as much as it did a trial of endurance. Despite these honed abilities, failure remained a frequent occurrence. A mistimed throw, an abrupt shift in wind direction, or the keen senses of a wary animal could transform a protracted hunt into a day of wasted effort. There were occasions when the group returned without any successful quarry, and it was during these times that the harvest, the gathering of plants, fruits, and roots, sustained their survival. Foraging held an importance no less significant than that of hunting. Early humans became astute observers of their surrounding environment. They learned to differentiate between safe berries and those that could be lethal. They unearthed roots hidden beneath the soil, peeling away their sometimes bitter outer layers to access the edible flesh within. They utilized stones to crack nuts, meticulously collecting every available morsel of nourishment. This activity, while slower and quieter than the hunt, was equally critical. A modest quantity of wild fruit or a collection of tubers could extend a dwindling meat supply sufficiently to allow the hunters another attempt. The knowledge required for this endeavor was substantial. Plant life varied with the seasons. Some fruits were safe only when fully ripe, while others necessitated soaking or pounding before consumption. This knowledge could not be acquired through mere guesswork. It had to be memorized and transmitted. A single error in judgment could result in poisoning not only an individual, but an entire group. Consequently, generation after generation, humans passed down a silent repository of vital information: where to locate food, how to prepare it, and which signs to trust when the forest or grassland presented an unfamiliar aspect. Food acquisition was not solely about sustenance, it dictated patterns of human movement. Entire communities followed the cyclical rhythm of their meals, traveling alongside migrating herds or returning annually to the same locations, known for their fruit and nut abundance. They learned the habits of animals not only for the purpose of hunting them, but also to benefit from what they left behind: carcasses abandoned by lions, trails of seeds dropped by birds, even leftovers from other scavengers. Nothing was considered waste. In time, hunting and foraging began to coalesce into a singular, balanced strategy. Meat offered dense, vital calories, while plants provided a reliable and consistent food source. Together, they enabled humans to endure. When one food source proved scarce, the other compensated for the deficit. This inherent adaptability granted humans a distinct advantage over most other species. They possessed the capacity to consume a wide variety of food and to survive in diverse environments. Nevertheless, both hunting and foraging entailed inherent risks. While hunting demanded courage and physical strength, foraging required constant vigilance. A hunter might face a charging animal, but a gatherer could equally encounter danger from a venomous snake coiled in the grass or a concealed predator lurking in the shadows. Every step taken in the pursuit of food was accompanied by the stark awareness that a single misstep could prove fatal. Yet, despite these pervasive dangers, the hunt and the harvest transcended mere survival tasks. They evolved into rituals. A successful hunt signified a period of celebration, an opportunity to partake in ample food, to rest, and to experience, albeit briefly, a sense of mastery over the environment. Foraging expeditions were generally quieter, but no less significant, often undertaken by small groups, where knowledge was exchanged and communal bonds were reinforced. These shared endeavors were not solely about satisfying hunger, they were about fostering a sense of belonging. And while nourishment sustained the physical body, it also provided humans with the temporal and energetic resources necessary for contemplation, planning, and innovation. A well nourished group possessed the capacity to create superior tools, to explore new territories, and to impart essential skills to their offspring, equipping them for future prosperity. Hunger, while a driving force, also propelled them forward, and each successful meal contributed to their gradual emancipation from desperation, moving them incrementally closer to achieving mastery over their world. Step by painstaking step, and meal by satisfying meal, the hunt and the harvest guided humanity through the Stone Age. They acquired not only the skills for survival, but also the means to flourish in environments where other species could not. They evolved into predators, gatherers, and above all, adept problem solvers. As their sustenance increased and their intellects sharpened, they began to lay the foundational structures for all that would subsequently unfold. However, sustenance constituted only one component of the broader struggle for existence. Even a satiated stomach offered no protection against the biting wind or the persistent rain. For that, humans required an entirely different provision: shelter, capable of providing a temporary bulwark against the encroaching wilderness. Food endowed humans with the resilience to persevere, yet sheer resilience alone was never sufficient. The world was far too cold, too damp, and too unforgiving for unprotected flesh and exposed terrain. Rainfall transformed the earth into treacherous mud. Gale force winds swept across the plains, rapidly stripping away precious body heat. Winter nights brought a frigid air so intense that each inhaled breath burned in the lungs. Without adequate protection, even the most formidable hunter or the most skilled gatherer would find their survival precarious. This underscores why shelter became as indispensable as fire or food itself, a barrier erected between human vulnerability and the relentless forces of nature. Initially, shelter was not constructed. it was discovered. Caves and natural rock overhangs offered innate protection from inclement weather. For countless generations, these served as humanity's most secure refuges. Within the confines of a cave, the wind's howl was muffled, the rain's drumming silenced, and the darkness held a predictable quality. Predators could still find ingress, but a single entrance was far more manageable to defend than the vast open wilderness. Families and small groups huddled together within these stony sanctuaries, utilizing the earth itself as a protective shield. However, caves were not universally available. Many regions lacked them entirely, and those that did exist were often already occupied by other human groups, or by the very predators they sought to evade. When natural caves were unavailable, humans demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They learned to build. Their earliest shelters were little more than rudimentary windbreaks, consisting of branches stacked against one another, animal hides stretched taut over poles, or pits excavated into the ground and subsequently covered with vegetation. Despite their simplicity, these improvised barriers could transform a freezing night into one that was survivable. Over time, these shelters evolved in sophistication. Communities began to utilize animal bones, particularly those from mammoths and other large prey animals, as structural frameworks for their dwellings. They draped these frameworks with animal hides, securing them with stones to prevent them from being dislodged by the wind. Some groups even excavated shallow depressions before commencing construction, partially sinking their homes into the ground to trap warmth. Each innovation arose not from a desire for comfort, but from the absolute imperative of survival. The distinction between a poorly constructed shelter and a well-crafted one could represent the critical difference between life and death. Within these shelters, existence assumed a different cadence. The external world was fraught with peril, predators prowled, storms raged, and the constant uncertainty of the wild prevailed. Within, however, there was warmth emanating from the fire, the comforting aroma of drying hides, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of respiration from those sleeping in close proximity. The walls, though perhaps crudely fashioned, offered something that humans had not previously experienced, a designated space that was unequivocally theirs. Shelter provided more than mere physical security. It fundamentally altered the nature of human habitation. Once a group possessed the ability to construct and maintain a protected space, the necessity for perpetual wandering in search of caves or other natural refuges diminished. They were able to establish a more settled existence, remaining in a particular location for extended periods. They were able to store provisions, reinforce their implements, and tend to their young without relocating their encampment every few days. Even if their lifestyle remained nomadic, these early domiciles provided them with a stability that the natural world alone could never afford. Domiciles also emerged as the primary hubs of human existence. Within them, tools were honed, pelts were scraped, and strategies for the subsequent hunt were devised. Children acquired knowledge by observing their elders as they prepared sustenance and fashioned weaponry by the faint radiance of the hearth. Narratives, whether articulated verbally or through gestures, were exchanged within the warmth of those spaces. What transpired beyond the domicile dictated survival. What transpired within dictated the essence of communal living. The construction and upkeep of these residences necessitated collaboration. No single individual could manage the colossal skeletal remains of a mammoth or stretch a hide sufficiently to enclose an entire framework. Groups had to coordinate their efforts, hoisting, binding, and securing each component, while others gathered fuel for the fire or maintained a lookout for peril. Shelter was not merely a bulwark against the tempest. It was evidence that humankind was developing interdependencies unmatched by any other species. The changing seasons compelled them to adapt further. During the summer months, their dwellings were more lightweight, simple constructions designed to ward off precipitation and offer respite from the sun's rays. In winter, they transitioned to more robust structures, built closer to the ground to conserve warmth and provide protection from the wind. Certain communities even insulated their dwellings with layers of herbage or moss, packing it into crevices to obstruct the frigid air. These minor modifications accumulated, enabling humans to endure in environments considerably more severe than their physical forms alone would have permitted. However, shelter was never infallible. A barrier of pelts could not silence the lament of wolves in the distance, nor could it prevent the fleeting shadow of a lurking predator. It could not fully withstand every tempest, nor entirely repel the encroaching chill. What it did, however, was grant them time. It provided humans with the opportunity to rest, recuperate, and contemplate. It transformed survival from a relentless sprint into a more akin to a persistent, arduous progression. And with every storm that passed while they remained dry and alive within, shelter acquired another quality, a source of assurance. For the first time, humans could confront the forces of nature and feel a glimmer of hope. That nascent sense of control, however modest, propelled the subsequent stages of their development. Shelter also facilitated something as vital as warmth or security: the capacity to envision future possibilities. A secure encampment meant that for a few precious hours, humans could gather around the fire and plan beyond the immediate moment. They could conceptualize the next expedition for sustenance, refine their implements, or mend what had been damaged. Within that space carved from the untamed wilderness, human existence attained the cadence it had always lacked, a locus where each day could build upon the previous one rather than commencing anew with an unyielding struggle each morning. Nevertheless, for every dwelling they erected, nature served as a reminder that they were merely borrowing space. Gusts dismantled frameworks. Deluges swept away encampments. Predators learned to lie in wait near the perimeters of human habitations, cognizant that hunger would inevitably compel someone to emerge. Survival was never absolute, merely prolonged. Yet each new dwelling stood as a pledge. Humans were no longer content to be driven across the land by tempests or expelled by the cold. They were learning to hold their territory. Those rudimentary abodes, fashioned from bone and hide, represented humanity's initial, albeit minor, act of defiance against the inexorable power of nature. They did not conquer the storm, but they resolutely refused to surrender to it entirely. Within those walls, tenuous, fragile, and imperfect, humanity unearthed something that would define them eternally: the resolve to forge a world that was theirs, even if it commenced with nothing more than sticks, stones, and the sheer will to endure another night. And as they settled within those confines, listening to the wind's howl and the rain's assault upon the earth, they understood that beyond their precarious sanctuary, other dangers lurked in the gloom. For while tempests and frost could be withstood, there was another presence that never ceased its observation: the nocturnal predators. Even within the sanctuary of their dwellings, early humans could not entirely shed the sensation of being watched. The night teemed with unseen eyes. Every snapping twig or low growl beyond the fire's reach served as a reminder that they were never truly solitary. Predators commanded the darkness, and if humans wished to persist, they had to learn to confront it. In those times, apprehension was not a weakness, but a prerequisite for survival. It sharpened every sense, compelling humans to attend to the subtle sounds that most creatures overlooked. They became attuned to the faint rustle of foliage that might indicate a stalking feline or the distant baying of hyenas circling in the gloom. The world after sunset was a perilous spectacle, and every sound, every silhouette, was a cue that demanded immediate attention. Consequently, humans cultivated a practice that would define them. They maintained a vigil. While some rested, others remained alert, their gaze sweeping the darkness beyond the fire's illuminated circumference. These sentinels listened for the heavy tread of a bear, the sharp crack of a branch broken by a substantial entity, or the soft, almost silent advance of a predator's paws. Slumber arrived in shifts, superficial and brief, yet it was sufficient to preserve the group's existence. The fire offered assistance but was not an impenetrable defense. Many predators harbored a fear of flames, yet hunger could render even the most audacious creatures reckless. A famished pack of wolves or a desperate wildcat might still test the periphery of the firelight. Humans swiftly learned that vigilance could not waver. A single lapse, a moment of inattention, and the night could engulf them entirely. These nocturnal guardians served a dual purpose, not only identifying threats but also comprehending them. Humans developed into adept observers of predators. They learned the vocalizations of various animals, discerning which sounds signaled a distant menace and which indicated immediate peril. They studied the stealthy hunting methods of lions, the cackling calls of hyenas in the darkness, and the way leopards hoisted their prey into trees. This acquired knowledge transformed dread into strategic action. To survive the night, they needed to understand who shared it with them. And in an unexpected manner, the night imparted something else: discipline. They learned to alternate watch duties, to trust that while they slept, another would stand guard. This trust fostered unity. The sentinels were not merely guards. They were the binding element that held the group together. Without them, fear would have driven each individual into restless solitude. But because someone was perpetually awake, the others could close their eyes, even if only momentarily. Children matured within this world of constant alertness. They heeded the warnings whispered by their progenitors, the subdued sounds that imposed silence upon the group, and the sharp, clipped calls signaling proximity to danger. These lessons became ingrained, transmitted from one generation to the next until even the youngest could decipher the night as if it were a map. Predators influenced more than just behavior. They shaped implements. Spears and sharpened stones served not only for hunting, but also as defensive tools. Humans learned to keep their weaponry within easy reach during their slumber. A sudden alert from a sentinel could mobilize the group, prepared to confront whatever dared to trespass the fire's boundary. Each successful defense bolstered the group's courage, though never their complacency. In the Stone Age, caution was not a preference, but the cost of survival. Even as humans guarded against the nocturnal threats, they also adapted to them. They learned to move with stealth when compelled to depart from the encampment's safety. They studied the wind's patterns to disperse their scent away from lurking hunters. Their eyesight adapted to the faint luminescence of starlight, and their hearing grew acute enough to detect the subtlest rustle of movement. For every predator that pursued them, they became more adept at stalking the night itself. In turn, predators pushed humans closer together. Individually, a person stood no chance against a lion or a pack of wolves. Collectively, they became a force that even the most formidable hunters hesitated to challenge. When danger loomed too closely, the group did not disperse. They closed ranks, spears pointed outward, the fire a buffer between them and the encroaching darkness. This unity, forged in fear, evolved into one of humanity's most significant strengths. Over time, those nights of vigilance cultivated more than just safety. They engendered awareness. Humans began to comprehend not only the behavior of predators, but also the broader cycles of the natural world. They observed which nights the howls were most frequent, when specific animals were most active, and how the quietude of the wilderness could signify either safety or an unseen threat. They were no longer merely subsisting in the dark. They were interpreting it, charting it, and gradually they were mastering it. And yet, despite their accumulated skills, the night never truly belonged to them. The darkness remained a domain of peril, a realm that belonged to the wild. But by maintaining their watch, by protecting one another through the prolonged hours between dusk and dawn, humans persevered. They became the beings who remained when others fled, who stood firm when the world plunged into blackness. Each dawn was a triumph. Every time the sentinels witnessed the arrival of daylight, they knew they had survived another night. And with each successive night, they acquired more knowledge, growing not only more prudent, but also more capable. The predators never vanished, but humans transformed into something new, the ones who watched back. This incessant confrontation with the darkness imparted a lesson extending far beyond the night itself. Survival was not solely contingent upon strength or even implements. It was a product of vigilance, recollection, and the steadfast determination to persevere even when fear remained a constant companion. And from those prolonged, watchful nights emerged the foundational element of human resilience, the understanding that danger would invariably be present, but so too would they. As they sat around their fires, weaponry within reach, and their gaze fixed upon the shifting darkness, they began to engage in something else entirely, something devoid of fear. They commenced to imbue the surrounding world with meaning, to leave marks and shapes upon stone, to depict the entities they perceived in the firelight and in their reveries. For after learning to observe the night, they learned to behold it, and then they began to render it. Within the secure confines of their dwellings, with fires burning low and the night kept at bay by watchful eyes, humans embarked on an unexpected endeavor. They began to draw. It was not sustenance, nor fire, nor weaponry. It provided neither warmth nor protection from predators. Yet, in caverns deep beneath the earth, and on walls illuminated solely by flickering flames, they marked the world around them. Initially, the depictions were rudimentary. The silhouette of an animal, the outline of a hand, crude lines incised into stone. But even these nascent marks carried significance. They were not arbitrary but deliberate. Someone chose to grasp a piece of charcoal or a fragment of colored mineral and press it against the rock. In that instant, survival ceased to be solely about the ensuing hunt or the coming storm. It became about memory. These renderings transcended mere embellishment. They served as chronicles. A herd of bison etched onto cave walls might have functioned as a reminder of their last known whereabouts, or an effort to convey that information to others. A series of dots could have signified the passage of days or the phases of the moon. Each line constituted a message, even if its intent has been obscured by the ravages of time. For their creators, the walls transformed into more than mere stone. They became a conduit for communication with the future. Some of these portrayals were remarkably intricate. In the caves of locations such as Lascaux and Chauvet, separated by millennia, the animals possess an almost lifelike quality. Horses gallop across the walls, their forms rendered with layers of ochre and charcoal. Mammoths lumber in hues of deep red and brown. These are not clumsy renderings, but observations conveyed with meticulous care. Whoever created them must have observed these creatures intently, understanding how muscles contracted during a run, how horns curved, how eyes gleamed in the firelight. These drawings attest to an attentiveness to the world that extended beyond the imperative of survival. But what motivated the act of drawing? Some scholars posit that these images served as a form of instruction, a visual lexicon passed between generations. A child might learn to identify the outline of a deer or the form of a bison before ever encountering one in its natural habitat. Others believe the depictions held a more profound purpose, rooted not merely in knowledge, but in belief. Perhaps depicting a successful hunt was a method of manifesting it into existence, a ritual intended to enhance the hunter's chances. There might have been another factor at play as well. In the ambient glow of the firelight, those images likely appeared animate. Shadows danced across the uneven surfaces of the walls, causing the painted animals to subtly shift and flicker as if in motion within the stone. It was the nascent form of magic, an illusion born from light imagination and the intrinsic human need to perceive meaning in all things. Yet, these paintings were not exclusively focused on animals or hunts. Amidst the imagery, handprints are evident, numbering dozens, sometimes hundreds, pressed against the walls. Some are small, akin to a child's palm. Others are larger, rougher, bearing the imprints of adults who had weathered countless winters. Each one was a declaration. I existed here. In a world where existence was fleeting and precarious, these marks served as testament that someone had lived, that their hand had made contact with the stone, and that they had left an indelible part of themselves behind. These early artisans did not labor in isolation. Groups likely convened in the deeper recesses of the caves, carrying torches to dispel the gloom as they painted. The aroma of smoke permeated the air, and the rasping sound of tools against stone mingled with hushed voices. In those moments, something novel was transpiring. Humans were not merely surviving in unison, they were creating collaboratively. Art, even in its most primordial form, constituted a shared language that required no verbal articulation. A painted mammoth needed no translation. A sequence of handprints spoke for itself. These markings evolved into a means for the collective to perceive their world not merely as it was, but as they comprehended it. This was not simply a diversion or a method of occupying time. It was integral to what rendered humans distinctly human. The same intellects that honed stones and tracked herds were now shaping symbols. They were no longer solely reacting to their environment, but beginning to interpret it. Every inscription on the wall represented a step towards something greater, a cognitive process that looked beyond the immediate necessities of hunger and shelter towards the expansive, enigmatic concept of meaning itself. The caves also became repositories of memory. Envision a child, guided by torchlight, entering a space where the walls were adorned with depictions of animals and handprints. They would not require explicit instruction regarding its significance. The weight of it would be palpable in the atmosphere, in the profound silence that must have pervaded those locations, and in the understanding that these marks were more than mere pictures. They were a dialogue across epochs, a reminder of their inclusion in a narrative that commenced long before their own existence. And as these images proliferated, they began to forge connections not only amongst individuals, but also with the surrounding world. Depicting an animal was an act of observation, of knowing it more intimately. It compelled the artist to scrutinize every curve, every line, every movement. In doing so, humans were not merely documenting the world, they were learning it, committing it to memory in a manner that sharpened their comprehension of everything upon which they depended. Even today, those paintings endure. They remain sequestered within the caves, untouched by the passage of centuries, silent witnesses to the minds that first conceived of something beyond mere survival. They serve as a reminder that long before the advent of agriculture, writing, or the initial cities, humans were already striving for something beyond the next meal or the coming night. But while they painted, while they imprinted their presence upon stone, life outside the caves continued unabated. The wind still howled, the cold still gnawed at their skin, and sooner or later, they had to relinquish the comfort of their painted walls and confront the wilderness once more. Because despite their burgeoning creativity, their lives remained dictated by a fundamental truth. Irrespective of their ingenuity or prudence, the world would not defer to them. It would transform, and they would be compelled to adapt. As humans adorned the walls of their caves and sharpened their implements by firelight, their existence continued to be shaped by mobility. They followed the seasonal cycles, the migratory patterns of herds, and the fluctuating rhythms of the land. However, over time, a subtle shift began to occur. Gradually, in specific locales, the perpetual wandering gave way to something novel, the nascent indications of permanence. The earliest settlements were not akin to the villages we recognize today. They lacked streets, fences, or enduring habitations. They were simply places to which humans repeatedly returned, drawn by factors such as safety, sustenance, or access to water. A bend in a river teeming with fish, a grove where wild fruits ripened annually, an expanse of open terrain frequented by predictable herd movements. These locations transcended mere temporary encampments. They became familiar territories. As groups began to frequent the same areas, their shelters evolved into more robust structures. Instead of flimsy windbreaks or hastily erected lean-tos, they constructed dwellings designed for extended duration. Hides stretched over substantial frames, walls reinforced with branches, and stones stacked in rough circular patterns to anchor their homes against the wind. These early abodes, while still simple, signified a transformation in humanity's perception of the land. It was no longer merely a backdrop for survival, but something they could actively shape. Residing in one location, even for a limited period, instigated profound changes. Fires no longer needed to be meticulously rebuilt each night. They could be maintained for weeks. Implements could be stored rather than transported from place to place. Provisions, when abundant, could be dried or smoked and preserved for leaner periods. This altered cadence provided humans with something previously elusive, a buffer against uncertainty. However, this transition introduced new challenges. Remaining in a single location led to the accumulation of waste and discarded food scraps, attracting animals. It necessitated larger groups sharing confined spaces without significant dispersion. It also alerted predators to their whereabouts. Humans adapted by organizing themselves with greater care. They arranged their shelters in clusters, positioned fires close enough for their illumination to overlap, and designated sentinels to guard the camp's perimeter. The genesis of community arose not from preference, but from necessity. And with community came connection. In these nascent settlements, knowledge disseminated more rapidly. A skilled artisan could impart their craft to others within the group, ensuring their techniques were not lost. When the group eventually relocated, hunters could share their acquired knowledge of the terrain or the behaviors of prey. Those who were injured or infirm were no longer as readily abandoned. They could receive care within the safety of the settlement. The initial villages also introduced another element: time. With the group congregated in one locale, certain individuals could dedicate themselves to tasks beyond the immediate pursuit of food or harvest. While some engaged in hunting, others repaired tools, cured hides, or maintained the perpetual fires. Labor became divided not solely by necessity, but by aptitude. Each individual fulfilled a distinct role, and collectively, these roles underpinned the group's overall survival. The land itself began to bear the imprint of this new way of life. Pathways formed where feet had trod the same routes repeatedly. Hearths blackened the ground where fires had burned in consistent locations for months on end. Bones and discarded implements accumulated in the soil, creating the rudimentary precursors to what would eventually be termed settlements. These places were not yet permanent, but they were no longer transient either. They represented an intermediate stage, a bridge connecting the migratory existence with the dawning world. And even as they established themselves in one location for extended periods, humans learned to defend it. They erected barriers from branches or stacked stones to fashion rudimentary walls. They cleared the ground surrounding their dwellings to enhance their visibility of approaching predators. For the very first time, the untamed wilderness was held at bay, even if only by a few modest steps. Each tiny advancement transformed the encampment into a place that felt less like temporary lodging and more like a firmly established territory. Yet, these initial settlements were more than just practical. They blossomed into the heart of something much more profound. In the comforting radiance of numerous fires burning closely together, people congregated not solely for security, but for companionship. They exchanged tales of the hunt, instructed the young on what to approach with caution and what to pursue, and engaged in the full spectrum of human emotion: laughter, disputes, and sorrow. These assemblies transcended mere existence. They represented the nascent stirrings of society, delicate yet undeniably present. As communities began to linger in these locales, attachments formed. A curve in the river was no longer merely a source of sustenance. It became imbued with memories. The place where a child took their first tentative steps, where a triumphant hunt was celebrated, where fires had blazed through extended winters. These recollections forged a connection between humanity and the land that was entirely novel. With each passing season that drew them back, the camps expanded. A few more dwellings appeared, the central fire grew larger, and more hands were available for construction, hunting, and guarding through the night. Guarding through. Gradually, these clusters evolved into something new. They were no longer just camps, but villages, still rudimentary, still transient in a way, but with foundations that deepened with each passing year. This marked no end to the nomadic lifestyle. Not yet. Journeys across unfamiliar territories and seasonal migrations continued. However, these early settlements served as a testament that humanity was beginning to shape the world to its requirements. For the first time, people were not merely traversing the landscape, they were starting to establish a genuine connection to it. And within these burgeoning villages, around the communal hearths, and in the company of their fellows, another vital aspect quietly developed. As humans came together and collaborated, they discovered innovative methods not only to subsist, but to provide mutual aid when survival came at a significant price. Existence in the initial hamlets offered people a degree of safety. However, this security did not eliminate peril. Injuries were a constant reality. A hunt gone awry could result in a deep laceration or a fractured limb. An unwary step in darkness might lead to a sprained ankle or worse. Ailments accompanied the changing seasons, bringing fevers that raged, persistent coughs, and insidious infections. In a world devoid of medical practitioners, remedies, or even a fundamental understanding of bodily failures, survival frequently hinged upon what could be achieved with bare hands, rudimentary implements, and the wisdom passed down from those who had previously navigated such challenges. The earliest form of care was not born of expertise, but of instinct. When someone was afflicted, others instinctively reached out. They applied pressure to wounds, to staunch bleeding and bandaged injuries with whatever materials were at hand. Strips of animal hide, fibrous grasses, or softened bark. They observed that cool water alleviated discomfort, that rest was essential, and that the warmth and presence of the group could be the deciding factor between recovery and demise. The genesis of healing lay not in accumulated knowledge, but in innate compassion. Over time, these instinctive responses transformed into something more deliberate. Humans began to perceive patterns. They recognized which plants offered solace and which proved poisonous. A bitter root might ease pain, a crushed leaf could reduce swelling, and the smoke from certain woods might clear airways, while others exacerbated respiratory issues. These insights were never codified in writing. They resided in collective memory, held within the minds of those who had witnessed the efficacy or failure of various treatments, and were subsequently shared in hushed tones around the fire. The very hands that hunted and erected shelters also became the nascent instruments of healing. Fingers meticulously cleaned wounds of debris. Palms were pressed against foreheads to gauge fever by touch alone, and bones and hides were fashioned into splints for broken extremities, secured tightly with sinew or plant fibers. Every action was driven by practicality, stemming from immediate need rather than an abstract understanding of internal bodily functions. Yet, even without comprehending the underlying mechanisms, early humans recognized that these methods often yielded positive results. Pain served as a potent instructor, as did the imperative to survive. If a particular intervention preserved a life, it was meticulously remembered. If it proved ineffective, it was discarded. Across generations, this process of trial and error evolved into a living form of medicine. Within each community, certain individuals possessed a superior recall of past experiences. Elders who had witnessed countless afflictions and injuries could readily recall what had proven beneficial previously. These individuals naturally became the first caregivers, not by virtue of any formal designation, but because others sought their counsel when fear and pain necessitated solutions. Healing extended beyond the physical realm. Emotional comfort was equally crucial. A supportive hand on a shoulder, a low, reassuring murmur, or a quiet word of encouragement could fortify an individual sufficiently to endure suffering. Even without understanding the precise reasons, humans discovered that the act of caring itself could significantly aid the wounded in their fight for life. Those who received such attention were more inclined to persevere than those left to face their ordeals in isolation. Thus, healing was never solely about administering treatment. It was fundamentally about fostering connection. The earliest remedies were sourced from the natural world. Plants provided leaves that could be pounded into poultices, roots to be chewed for relief, and resins to seal wounds. Some groups burned aromatic herbs within their dwellings, believing the resulting smoke would expel illness. Others discovered that clay could soothe burns or that salt harvested from dried riverbeds could cleanse injuries. These discoveries unfolded gradually, but each one was carefully preserved and disseminated through word of mouth until it became an integrated aspect of human existence. Even the deceased contributed valuable lessons. A hunter succumbing to a festering wound provided crucial knowledge for those who had witnessed its progression. A fever that swept through a village offered survivors insights into which remedies offered even the slightest alleviation. Suffering etched indelible memories into the minds of those who endured it, and these memories were faithfully passed on. Healing also necessitated collaborative effort. If a hunter sustained an injury, others had to assume their responsibilities until the individual recovered. Should a mother fall ill, the community would tend to her offspring until she regained her strength. Illness and injury were never isolated events. Their impact rippled outwards, and the collective group absorbed the associated burdens. This shared responsibility transcended mere survival tactics. It represented the earliest manifestation of a broader principle, a sense of accountability towards one another. Around the communal fire, healing took on a ritualistic quality. Wounds were meticulously cleansed, herbs were carefully applied, and bones were set with steady, practiced hands. Children observed these procedures, absorbing the lessons implicitly. Each act of care was an educational experience, and each lesson contributed to the development of something more significant: the understanding that survival depended not only on physical prowess or swiftness, but also on accumulated wisdom and empathy. Even in the most formidable circumstances, these small victories held considerable weight. A fractured bone that mended correctly, enabled a hunter to resume their pursuit of prey. A fever that subsided meant another capable individual for food gathering. Every life preserved bolstered the group as a whole. And gradually, as these accumulated lessons became ingrained, humans evolved beyond being merely hunters, gatherers, and builders. They became healers as well. The surrounding environment remained inherently perilous. However, they now possessed methods to mitigate its consequences. They had fire for warmth, protective structures for safety, implements for defense, and hands capable of mending what the wilderness sought to damage. With every treated wound and every overcome illness, their conviction grew that they could not only outlast the darkness of night, but also the unending trials the world would inevitably present. Yet, even healing, as critically important as it was, constituted only one facet of their struggle. The land itself possessed its own inherent rhythms, cycles of abundance alternating with periods of scarcity. For humanity to endure, they would need to master these natural cycles with the same proficiency they applied to their tools or the articulation of their speech. The era of the Stone Age was not static. It underwent transformations dictated by the seasons, with each shift introducing new challenges. Humans lacked formal calendars, timekeeping devices, or written records to track the progression of time. They learned to comprehend the annual cycle not through numerical systems, but through direct observation of the environment. This included the duration of daylight, the angle of the sun, the subtle scents in the air, and the observable behavior of wildlife. Survival hinged upon accurately interpreting these indicators and adapting their actions before the world turned hostile. Spring represented a time of regeneration. Following extended severe winters, the snow receded, rivers swelled with meltwater, and the land gradually reawakened. Vegetation emerged from the soil, and animals that had sought refuge from the cold reappeared, grazing in new pastures. For humankind, spring signified movement. Camps were dismantled as groups followed the fresh growth, seeking out novel food sources. Hunters meticulously tracked the movements of returning herds, while gatherers diligently searched for the earliest edible shoots and berries. It was a period of plentiful resources, but it also demanded considerable effort. To ensure their survival through the ensuing winter, they had to capitalize on every opportunity while nature was generous. Summer offered both comfort and inherent dangers. With prolonged daylight hours and mild nights, food was abundant. Rivers teemed with fish, and forests were laden with ripening fruit. However, summer also presented significant risks. Intense heat could deplete water sources, compelling groups to travel greater distances. Insect populations proliferated, acting as vectors for disease. Predators were at their peak strength, well nourished and exhibiting little fear, often competing with humans for the same quarry. To navigate the summer months successfully, humans had to employ considerable ingenuity. They learned to preserve food in shaded subterranean pits or suspended at elevated heights, safeguarding it from scavengers. They rose early to hunt before the oppressive heat descended and conserved their energy for the cooler hours of dusk. Each season presented distinct lessons in timing, and summer delivered these lessons with particular urgency. Autumn heralded a different phase. It was a season dedicated to preparation. Humans understood, even without precise timekeeping, that the environment was on the cusp of transformation. Herds became increasingly agitated and began their migrations towards winter pastures. Vegetation withered and receded into the earth. The air grew noticeably colder, carrying the initial intimation of the approaching winter. During these months, humans toiled with relentless energy. They hunted in excess of their immediate needs, employing techniques of drying and smoking meat to prevent spoilage. They gathered roots and nuts that would sustain them through the frost. They reinforced their shelters, sealing any openings, and accumulated as much firewood as they could procure. Then winter descended, presenting the most formidable challenge of all. Food became exceedingly scarce, and the biting cold penetrated bone and muscle. Rivers froze over, snow blanketed the landscape, herds migrated to distant valleys, and the plants that had provided sustenance for months vanished. Winter was not a season to be overcome through force. It was a season to be endured with resilience. In the profound cold, humans remained close to their shelters, congregating around the fires. They subsisted on their stored provisions and relied on the mutual warmth of their companions. Hunters who ventured out faced an environment of stark silence and ice, where even the slightest misstep could prove fatal. They followed the faint tracks of emaciated animals, recognizing that each successful kill was critical to their family's survival for another week. And throughout this arduous period, the fire burned continuously, serving as the tenuous boundary between life and the encroaching deadly chill. Yet winter also imparted valuable lessons. It taught the virtue of patience. It instilled the necessity of restraint. It compelled humans to plan meticulously, to contemplate the future, and to envision a reality beyond the immediate frozen present. Each successful winter demonstrated the profound importance of foresight, equaling that of physical strength. Those who persevered carried this hard-won knowledge forward, integrating it into the fundamental rhythm that governed their existence. Over successive generations, these recurring seasonal patterns profoundly influenced human behavior. They adopted migratory patterns not solely dictated by the animals they pursued, but by an innate understanding of the land itself. They knew when rivers would flood, when fruits would ripen, and when snow would immobilize them. Their lives became interwoven with the world's cycles, moving in concert with nature rather than in opposition to it. This adherence to natural rhythms transcended mere survival. It marked the genesis of a deeper, more intrinsic connection to the earth. The land transformed from an unpredictable adversary into a wise instructor. Its seasons offered both implicit warnings and tangible rewards, penalizing those who failed to prepare and favoring those who observed diligently and remembered faithfully. Humans began to perceive the world not merely in terms of its immediate offerings, but in how it transformed, finding a sense of order within these cyclical changes. During the long winter months, elders likely recounted accounts of past seasons, times when herds had arrived late, when the cold had been unusually severe, or when food had been either scarce or abundant. These narratives were not mere diversions. They served as intricate maps of collective memory, guiding younger generations through the cyclical challenges they would inevitably encounter in their own lives. Each recounted story acted as a hidden survival manual embedded within a cherished memory. The seasons provided humans with more than just knowledge. They imparted a sense of identity. They were no longer simply transient wanderers reacting to immediate circumstances. They evolved into meticulous planners, skilled builders, and diligent custodians of accumulated wisdom. Their lives were measured not by the passage of individual days, but by the grander turning of the world itself. And with each subsequent year, a singular lesson became increasingly evident. Survival depended not only on adapting to the external environment, but also on adapting to one another. The extended winters and challenging summers fostered closer interpersonal bonds, demonstrating that collaboration was not an optional consideration, but an absolute prerequisite for progress. This spirit of cooperation would soon mature into something far more substantial, transforming disparate family units into tightly knit communities, and these communities into cohesive tribes bound by mutual trust, shared history, and an unwavering collective will to persevere. While the seasons dictated the outward patterns of human existence, it was their relationships with each other that truly shaped their capacity for survival. In isolation, an individual stood virtually no chance against the formidable challenges of the Stone Age. A solitary hunter could not defend against a formidable predator, stockpile sufficient provisions for winter, or maintain a fire through the prolonged nights. Survival was not an individual undertaking. It was a collective endeavor built upon the combined strength of many. From this fundamental necessity emerged the enduring bonds of the tribe. A tribe represented far more than a mere aggregation of families. It was an intricate network of trust and shared accountability. Each member fulfilled a distinct and vital role. The most powerful hunters were responsible for bringing down the largest game, while others undertook the tasks of transport, preparation, and preservation. Craftsmen with exceptional skill chipped stone into edges sharper than any animal's teeth, fashioning the blades and spear points upon which the hunters depended. Elders, no longer capable of the strenuous chase, became the living repositories of the tribe's memory. They preserved the knowledge of past winters, treacherous routes, and reliable food sources that could sustain them when all other options were exhausted. Children matured within this structured environment, surrounded by the watchful eyes of the entire community. They learned to walk not only under the direct care of their parents, but also under the subtle guidance of the tribe as a whole. They observed the proper way to grip a stone, the correct technique for throwing a spear, and the importance of listening intently for signs of danger carried on the wind. Their education was not formalized through structured lessons as we understand teaching today. Rather, it was acquired through constant observation, imitation, and daily immersion in the presence of those who had successfully navigated the trials of existence before them. Around the communal fire, the tribe transcended its identity as a mere collection of individuals. It coalesced into a singular, living entity, united by their shared struggles. Food was not hoarded by individuals, it was equitably distributed. A successful hunt was a cause for collective celebration, and a failed hunt was a hardship endured by all. In this manner, survival became a shared responsibility. Trust was not a discretionary luxury, it was the very foundation upon which the tribe's cohesion rested. Conflict undoubtedly occurred. Even in these nascent stages, scarcity of food and pervasive fear could ignite anger. However, in the face of the vast, unforgiving wilderness, cooperation held greater significance than personal pride. When danger loomed, whether from predators, severe weather, or rival groups, internal disputes were set aside in favor of unified action. The bonds within a tribe were not flawless, but they possessed the resilience to endure because such endurance was essential. These connections were further solidified not only by necessity, but also by the establishment of rituals. Communal meals shared around the fire served a purpose beyond mere sustenance. They were a tangible reinforcement of the understanding that no one faced their challenges alone. Stories passed down from elders to children functioned as both a collective memory and a cautionary guide, linking each new generation to the hardships and triumphs of those who preceded them. Every narrative of survival was a thread woven into the very fabric of the tribe, reminding every member of their belonging to something far greater than their individual selves. Even grief was a shared experience. When an individual passed away, their absence was felt not by a select few, but by the entire community. The tribe collectively bore this burden, and in doing so, they cultivated another profound form of strength, the resilience to continue moving forward even when loss inflicted deep wounds. Every fire rekindled after such moments, every hunt undertaken despite overwhelming sorrow, served as undeniable proof that no single life existed in isolation. They endured collectively. The tribe also provided the primary bulwark against the unknown. In a world where peril could emerge from any direction, no single individual could remain vigilant against every potential threat. However, with numerous eyes and many hands working in concert, the tribe transformed into a living shield. Hunters maintained watch while others rested. When predators ventured too close, the tribe collectively repelled them, their spears and voices transforming fear into a formidable and unyielding force. And within the embrace of these relationships, another significant element began to flourish: identity. An individual was no longer solely defined by their personal attributes. They were an integral part of a group possessing its own unique methods of hunting, specific preferred dwelling places, and distinct narratives explaining the world around them. These divergences mark the earliest indications of cultural development. Each tribe carried forward a unique strand of human history, shaped by the landscapes they traversed and the lives they led. Cooperation also facilitated the development of specialized skills. Not every individual was required to function as a hunter or gatherer at all times. Those possessing the keenest ability to track prey could lead the hunting expeditions. Individuals with exceptionally steady hands could dedicate their efforts to crafting superior tools. Those with exceptional memories could impart the vital knowledge of plants, seasonal cycles, and potential dangers that might otherwise go unnoticed until it was too late. No single person could master every aspect of survival. However, the tribe, collectively, could achieve this. This collective competence brought a level of security previously unknown to humanity. A solitary individual might falter, but a tribe possessed the capacity to endure. When one member fell ill, others provided care. When one sustained an injury, others hunted in their stead. When one was lost, others preserved their memory through the stories shared around the fire. The interconnected bonds of the tribe transformed survival from an individual struggle into a shared experience. And within this shared endeavor, humans discovered their first true source of strength. However, These connections did more than merely ensure their physical survival. They laid the essential groundwork for the future world. Cooperation transcended being a mere survival strategy. It became an intrinsic component of what it meant to be human. The instinctive impulses cultivated within those early tribes, trust, loyalty, and a commitment to collaborative effort, would profoundly shape every stage of humanity's journey beyond the Stone Age. As these tribes gathered closely around their fires, with sparks ascending into the vast darkness of the sky, they engaged not only in the effort to ward off the night, but also in the process of establishing their rightful place within it. With the tools held firmly in their hands and the fire serving as their steadfast companion, they shifted their focus to an aspect that would bring about yet another transformative change: the evolution of the tools themselves, progressing from simple stones to instruments of sophisticated mastery. The tribal affiliations provided humans with the advantage of sheer numbers. However, their true power stemmed from their capacity to create with their hands. Stone and bone emerged as the fundamental building materials for survival. Each element was meticulously shaped, not only by the dictates of necessity, but also by the quiet, burgeoning ingenuity that had been evident since the initial striking of a sharp edge from a piece of rock. With every tool they fashioned, humans extended their reach, moving progressively beyond a life of mere endurance and advancing towards a future where the world could be reconfigured according to their desires. The earliest tools crafted from stone were remarkably simple: flakes chipped from larger rocks, possessing edges sharp enough to slice through meat or scrape animal hides. Yet, over the span of generations, these rudimentary edges underwent a significant evolution. Hunters learned to strike stones at precise, calculated angles, resulting in points that were both sharper and more durable. They discovered that certain types of stone, such as flint or obsidian, fractured in predictable and controlled ways, yielding razor-thin edges capable of cleanly severing flesh and sinew. These advancements were no longer attributable to chance. They were deliberate choices born from keen observation and accumulated knowledge. Bone, too, transformed into a valuable resource. Initially, it comprised only the remnants left after a meal, discarded fragments from the skeletal remains of their prey. However, humans soon recognized its inherent potential. A sharpened rib or a splintered femur could pierce with the same efficacy as stone. A hollowed bone could serve a multitude of purposes, functioning as a container, a signaling whistle, or even as the shaft for a weapon. Where other creatures left bones to decay, humans repurposed them into practical tools. Utilizing stone and bone in conjunction, a novel toolkit began to emerge. Stone blades were employed to cut hides into functional clothing, while bone needles were used to meticulously pierce these materials for stitching. Stone implements allowed the severing of branches and the cleaving of wood for fire, while bone tools were adept at perforating hides and bark. The community was no longer restricted to the capabilities of their unaided hands. Their crafted items became extensions of their intent. This evolution was not merely utilitarian, it was cognitive. The creation of tools necessitated ingenuity. An individual holding a rough piece of flint had to envision its potential before it physically manifested. They had to apply force with foresight, understanding that an ill-judged strike could nullify hours of effort. Each implement represented a lesson in causality, a silent education in the manipulation of the environment. Youngsters absorbed this craft by observing the seasoned individuals at work. They witnessed the deliberate tapping of stone against stone, the careful rotation and examination of chips before another blow was struck. They learned to hold their breath at the instant of impact, awaiting the sound that signaled a clean fracture. These teachings were conveyed not through discourse but through action. Each movement was replicated until it became ingrained. Bone implements introduced a further degree of sophistication. Unlike stone, bone was lighter and could be fashioned into delicate points. Hunters began employing bone-tipped spears capable of striking with greater depth and accuracy. Fish hooks meticulously carved from bone enabled people to extract sustenance from rivers and lakes, lessening their sole reliance on terrestrial pursuits. Scrapers fashioned from rib bones were used to render hides supple, making them pliable enough to fashion into body coverings. The tools themselves were not the sole agents of change. Their very existence reshaped human existence. With sharpened edges and robust points, they could pursue larger quarry more effectively. A single successful hunt could sustain the tribe for days, liberating time for other endeavors. With bone needles, they could stitch garments tightly enough to ward off severe cold, enabling habitation in previously inhospitable regions. And each novel tool carried with it a wave of advancement. Enhanced weaponry facilitated safer hunting. Superior attire simplified travel. Improved vessels, crafted from bone, hide, or hollowed wood, allowed for the transportation of provisions over greater distances and their extended preservation. Each enhancement unveiled new prospects, and each prospect propelled humans further into territories that would have previously been inaccessible. In the evenings gathered around the hearth, tools underwent repair and sharpening. The resonance of stone impacting stone or bone, scraping against rock, permeated the stillness between the flickering flames. These were not merely the sounds of subsistence, but the audible manifestations of contemplation, of hands shaping a future, one sharpened edge at a time. However, tools possessed a significance extending beyond their functional utility. Some were fashioned with a dedication that surpassed mere necessity. Certain bone points were meticulously smoothed and polished until they acquired a lustrous sheen. Some stones were chipped into forms that bordered on the aesthetic, their equilibrium and regularity far exceeding the demands of basic survival. This suggested a nascent development, pride, even artistry, in human creations. These artifacts also conveyed deeper significance. A finely wrought spear could be bequeathed from one generation to the next. A bone pendant might be worn, not merely for adornment, but as a representation of skill or social standing. Tools, once solely instruments of requirement, became integral to the perception humans held of themselves and each other. And with each new implement, humanity grew more daring. They began venturing into more severe climates, equipped with superior weaponry and more resilient clothing. They confronted larger quarry and erected more robust dwellings. What commenced with a simple chipped stone had evolved into a revolution, with stone and bone at its nucleus. Yet, the world remained expansive, and the forthcoming challenges were numerous. For every implement they devised, new predicaments arose. The terrain altered, the climate shifted, herds migrated, and predators adapted. Survival was never a conquest. It was a perpetual struggle waged daily. Nevertheless, with stone and bone in their grasp, Humankind possessed the means to persevere. They had the capacity to endure, to adjust, and to confront the unknown. For soon, those implements would not only aid in hunting and construction, but would also imbue them with the fortitude to face the most formidable creatures inhabiting the earth, the colossal beings that towered above them, those that tested their every exertion of strength and every flicker of inventiveness. With more acute tools in their hands and the collective strength of the tribe at their backs, humankind turned their gaze toward the paramount challenge of the Stone Age, the colossal fauna of their era. Mammoths, bison, and other immense beasts roamed the plains in seemingly inexhaustible herds. They were perilous, unpredictable, and powerful enough to crush a person effortlessly. Yet they also represented a promise. A single successful hunt could provide sustenance for an entire tribe, supply winter garments, and yield bones and sinew for tool production. Pursuing these giants was never without risk, but it was indispensable. The hunt commenced long before the initial projectile was launched. It began with meticulous observation. Tribes familiarized themselves with the behavioral patterns of these colossal animals, their migratory paths, their feeding grounds, and the seasons when their movements naturally decelerated. They observed from a distance, sometimes for days, noting where a herd rested and how the wind carried their scent. Patience constituted as significant a weapon as any spear. Haste courted failure, and failure when confronting such quarry meant more than mere privation. It meant demise. When the opportune moment arrived, the hunt transformed into a test of collective action. No solitary hunter could confront a mammoth or subdue a bison alone. These creatures were overwhelmingly strong, vast, and hazardous. However, a coordinated tribal effort could transmute the hunt into a calculated maneuver. Some individuals would encircle widely to direct the animals forward, while others would await with poised spears, prepared to strike from the flanks. The fire-hardened tips of their weapons, tipped with stone or bone, gleamed in the sunlight as they advanced. The atmosphere during these hunts was likely charged with intensity. Apprehension and resolve converged within every heartbeat. A single misstep, a poorly timed throw, and the prey could retaliate. A charging mammoth was not merely an animal. It was a living bulwark of muscle and bone that could scatter hunters like wind-blown leaves. Nevertheless, they stood their ground. At times, the terrain itself became an ally. Tribes learned to guide the great beasts toward ravines or ensnare them in marshy ground, where their immensity became a liability. They employed fire to steer herds, brandishing torches and shouting until the animals bolted in the desired direction. In this manner, intellect triumphed over brute force. Though diminutive, humans were astute, and against these giants, astuteness proved sufficient. When a beast finally succumbed, the hunt reached its culmination, but the work was just beginning. Dozens of hands worked in unison, skinning, butchering, and transporting every usable part of the animal. The hide was substantial and weighty, sufficient for constructing shelters or fashioning garments that could withstand the harshest winter winds. The bones were repurposed into spears, scrapers, and the structural elements of dwellings. Even the sinew was preserved, twisted into robust cords for securing weapons or binding injuries. Nothing was squandered by a tribe. A single successful hunt provided more than mere sustenance. It ensured survival for weeks occasionally months. Stomachs were filled, fires burned brighter, and spirits were uplifted. Children were served the choicest portions, and the elders were honored with food in appreciation for their guidance. In these moments, the tribe celebrated not solely the kill, but their collective bond. They had confronted something immense and formidable together, and they had prevailed. Yet, the inherent risks persisted. Not every hunt concluded successfully. Occasionally, the giants evaded capture, vanishing into the distance with a swiftness that outpaced the hunters. At other times, the hunters returned injured or not at all. Each endeavor carried the implicit understanding that this might be the one that demanded a higher price. Nevertheless, they persisted in their pursuit. Hunger left them with no alternative. The hunt for giants shaped the human psyche as profoundly as it shaped the human physique. It cultivated discipline, coordination, and the efficacy of strategic planning. It demanded valor, yet it rewarded those capable of critical thought, adaptability, and collaborative effort. These hunts were not merely confrontations between humans and wildlife. They were educational experiences, each one imprinting the lessons of survival onto the collective memory of the tribe. Around the communal fire, once the immediate danger had receded, the narratives of these hunts were recounted repeatedly. Children listened with rapt attention as the elders recounted the charge of a mammoth or the precise moment a spear found its mark. These stories served not only to foster pride, but also as a form of training. Every word prepared the subsequent generation for the day they would join the chase themselves. Even the landscape bore testament to these hunts. Scattered across ancient plains lie remnants of mammoth bones, arranged in formations that suggest intentionality, circles and patterns that might have served as foundations for shelters or markers of ritualistic significance. These vestiges speak of a world where survival was etched in both bloodshed and ingenuity, where every hunt left an indelible mark, not only on the people, but on the very earth they traversed. And as the tribes mastered the art of hunting giants, they acquired a further understanding. They were no longer merely subsisting within their world, they were actively shaping it. They emerged as predators unparalleled in their kind, small in stature, yet equipped with tools, fire, and an intellect sharp enough to fell creatures many times their size. However, in pursuing these immense beasts, they also became diligent students of the wild. They observed the animals' movements, their feeding habits, and how the changing seasons dictated their migratory patterns. In the colossal shadows of these giants, humans learned to keenly observe not only their prey, but also the subtle lessons the world offered daily. And those lessons, the quiet teachings conveyed by wind, water, and earth, would become their next significant advantage. For soon, survival would be contingent not solely on the potency of their spears, but on the accumulated knowledge gleaned from the natural world and the wisdom they carried forward into every hunt, every shelter, and every fire they ignited against the encroaching darkness. Every pursuit, every seasonal cycle, every extended night spent by the fire imparted knowledge to humanity. Yet, their most profound instructors were not the giants they felled, nor even the implements they crafted. Their most significant teachers were the world itself. The silent, constant forces that envelop them, the wind, the rivers, the constellations, and the ever-shifting contours of the land, spoke to those who possessed the discernment to observe and attend. For humanity to endure, they had to embrace the role of earth scholars. Long before the advent of agriculture or the establishment of permanent settlements, they comprehended that nature operated according to an intrinsic rhythm. The sun's trajectory across the sky served as their clock, devoid of numerals. The chill in the air heralded the impending frost. The calls of migrating birds conveyed forewarnings of seasonal transitions. None of these insights were formally documented. They were acquired through silent observation, passed down through generations via gestures, oral traditions, and the watchful eyes of those who had navigated the world for longer. The sky was among their earliest navigational aids. By day, the sun's arc across the horizon functioned as a timekeeper. By night, the stars provided a celestial map. Humans noted the recurring appearance of specific constellations during particular times of the year. They followed these celestial markers, using them to track the seasons and to ascertain when it was opportune to follow migrating herds or return to familiar territories where sustenance would be readily available. Without charts or instruments, they learned to navigate by memory and intuition, guided by the same celestial bodies that illuminate our night sky today. The land itself served as another mentor. Hunters interpreted the ground as if it were a written language. A bent blade of grass or a faint impression in the mud indicated the direction an animal had taken. A broken branch revealed not only direction, but also the creature's size and velocity. They learned to gauge the ground beneath their feet, discerning its moisture content to understand the implications for the animals that depended upon it. Even the wind carried valuable intelligence. Its direction could betray their presence to their prey or carry the scent of predators to their camp before danger became visually apparent. Disregarding it courted catastrophe, but utilizing it transformed the unseen into a tactical advantage. Hunters crouched low and moved against the wind, rendering themselves imperceptible to the olfactory senses of the creatures they stalked. This was not a matter of chance, but of honed skill, refined over generations of trial and error until it became instinctual. Water, too, communicated its own distinct messages. The water level of a river indicated the extent of distant snowmelt. The taste of a stream revealed its potability. They observed that fish congregated in calm pools, that animal trails invariably led to watering sources, and that where water flowed, life followed. These were not trivial discoveries. In an era devoid of wells or stored provisions, understanding the behavior of water was as critical as the act of respiration. Plants served as both benevolent allies and silent adversaries. Some possessed healing properties, while others were lethal. A solitary error in selecting the wrong forage or berry could prove fatal. However, those who observed diligently learned which leaves soothed abrasions, which bark alleviated pain, and which herbs repelled illness. They acquired this knowledge through observation, certainly, but also through the harsh tuition of failure. Every discovered remedy was preserved in memory, often paid for with the suffering of preceding generations. Animals, too, imparted lessons, even those not targeted for hunting. Birds took flight in sudden bursts, signaling the presence of unseen predators. Wolves and other carrion feeders led them to fresh kills that could be scavenged for meat. The behavior of prey animals, when they grazed, where they rested, how they fled, became a survival roadmap, imprinted onto the minds of every hunter who lived long enough to impart it. From these accrued lessons emerged a form of wisdom that was neither ostentatious nor overt. It was not the knowledge of tools or fire, but the understanding of ecological balance. Humans realized that confronting the world with brute force was a losing proposition. To thrive, they had to move in concert with their environment, hunting when prey was abundant, retreating when storms raged, and conserving their energy when the land became parched. This state of harmony was not synonymous with peace, but it represented comprehension, and that comprehension bestowed upon them a form of power. The elders within each tribe served as the custodians of this accumulated wisdom. They recalled which valleys experienced flooding in the spring, which orchards yielded fruit in the late summer, and which routes the herds followed when the cold intensified. Around the fire, they discussed these matters not as directives, but as narratives, weaving the threads of survival into memory for the benefit of the young. In this manner, every hunt, every tempest, every hardship transmuted into a lesson that transcended the lives of those who first endured it. These silent instructors did more than ensure human survival. They refined their intellects. Every discernible pattern, every subtle sign they followed, constituted a step toward perceiving the world not merely as it existed, but as something that could be deciphered and understood. Over time, that comprehension would blossom into something even more profound: the nascent curiosity regarding the fundamental reasons behind these patterns. For the present, however, the lessons were simple and immediate. The wind, the stars, the rivers, and the tracks imprinted in the mud were sufficient. They communicated a language predating spoken words, and humans, exhibiting patience and attentiveness, learned to listen. And that ability to listen was what would prepare them for the ensuing challenge, a challenge that would arise not from the celestial sphere, the rivers, or the herds, but from the very fabric of the world undergoing transformation beneath their feet. For a time would inevitably arrive when the frigid temperatures intensified, when the terrain shifted, and when survival would depend not only on acquired knowledge, but also on the indomitable will to persevere through a world dramatically altered. The world was in a perpetual state of flux. Even as humans acquired proficiency in interpreting the language of the wind, the stars, and the rivers, the earth itself could undergo transformations that no tribe could afford to disregard. Glacial ice advanced across the land. Forests yielded to open plains. Animals that had once been plentiful vanished, or migrated to regions far beyond familiar migratory routes. When the world changed, humanity was compelled to adapt in tandem, lest they be left behind. The ice ages commenced subtly, but exerted an unyielding influence. Cold permeated vast territories, converting fertile expanses into frozen wastelands incapable of sustaining growth. Rivers became encased in sheets of ice, and snow blanketed the ground for extended periods. The great herds migrated southward in search of sustenance and warmth, and the tribes followed suit. Migration ceased to be a mere option. It became a mandate for survival. These arduous journeys spanned weeks or even months, with individuals carrying only their most essential possessions. They tracked the movements of animals, observed the skies for climatic indicators, and relied on the ingrained knowledge of their elders who had previously traversed these routes. Each step was inherently perilous. A miscalculation in direction could lead to barren landscapes or a frigid demise. However, Those who moved in unison with the herds survived, while those who remained behind were lost to the snow. The pervasive cold compelled human innovation. Animal hides alone proved insufficient. They necessitated further processing into thicker layers, meticulously stitched to create a barrier against the wind. Shelters were reinforced, excavated to greater depths, and in some instances, partially subterranean structures were erected to retain precious warmth. Fires were diligently tended, guarded as if they were living entities, as their extinguishment during the depths of winter could prove fatal. The nature of hunting also transformed. Many of the species that had previously been accessible prey either migrated or disappeared altogether. In their stead emerged new challenges, creatures larger, more robust, and better adapted to the frigid conditions. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses presented both a valuable resource and a significant threat. Their sheer size offered sustenance for a tribe for many weeks, but also possessed the potential to crush any who approached without extreme caution. Hunting them demanded not only courage, but also a level of strategic planning and cooperation unprecedented in prior endeavors. However, the cold was not the sole catalyst for change. As ice advanced in certain regions, it simultaneously receded in others. Land bridges emerged where oceans had previously existed, forging connections between distant continents for the first time in human history. New territories became accessible, bringing with them both fresh opportunities and inherent dangers. The world evolved from a single familiar domain into a vast, dynamic, and largely uncharted expanse. Tribes that had occupied the same valleys for successive generations began to venture farther than ever before. They traversed frozen tundras and followed coastlines, adapting to novel landscapes and acquiring new survival methodologies. In each new locale, the world imparted fresh lessons: how to procure sustenance from icy waters, how to track animals across snowy terrain, and how to gather flora that had never before flourished in their native lands. Migration transcended mere survival, becoming an agent of transformation. These shifts profoundly influenced not only human lifestyles, but also their very identities. In the face of climatic instability and dwindling resources, the tribes that persisted were those that demonstrated the greatest capacity for rapid adaptation. They readily shared their knowledge, fostered mutual reliance, and transmitted the wisdom gleaned from their journeys. The world was formidable, yet it also served as an educator, compelling them to cultivate greater strength, enhanced intellect, and more profound interconnectedness. And amidst this continuous movement, humans began to disseminate. Some followed the coastlines, learning to harvest resources from the sea. Others ventured inland, mastering the intricacies of forests and rivers. Some braved the extreme cold of northern territories, while others flourished in the warmth of southern plains. Each distinct path fostered a unique way of life. Yet all were united by a singular verity. Regardless of the Earth's transformations, humanity would persist in its movement. This inherent adaptability, the capacity to relocate when the world dictated, was the cornerstone of their survival. While other species were tethered to their environments, humans were not. They carried their tools, their fire, their knowledge, and their unwavering determination across every new horizon. Where one location proved insufficient, another awaited. The world could undergo any degree of change. Humanity would adapt in kind. Nevertheless, the ice, And the shifting landscapes did more than merely test their resilience. They ignited a deeper sense of awe. To witness the sun ascend over a frozen expanse, to observe herds disappear into a white horizon, to stand at the precipice of an ocean where the very land had receded. These were moments that left an indelible imprint. In those moments, humans were no longer merely surviving. For the very first time, they were beholding the sheer immensity of the world. Within this grand expanse, another profound transformation began to coalesce. As their journeys lengthened and their experiences deepened, they carried not just their implements and the essential flame, but also a growing repository of concepts and convictions which would solidify around their nightly fires. When confronted by a world so boundless and unpredictable, they started to seek underlying significance. In this quest, something novel emerged: rituals and narratives exchanged in the flickering illumination. These were the nascent stirrings of a profound yearning, extending beyond mere sustenance or protection. It was the deep-seated desire to comprehend their very presence in existence. In a world that was immense, often unforgiving and chilling, humanity drew near their hearths, not solely for comfort from the cold, but for something more fundamental. The embers crackled, casting elongated shadows that danced upon the interiors of their crude dwellings. Within that gentle radiance, contemplation began. They had mastered the arts of the hunt, the construction of shelters, the navigation of territories, and the capacity to persevere. Yet, as they convened, observing the upward drift of embers into the velvety darkness, they grappled with inquiries that their tools and the fire alone could not resolve. The fire transcended its practical functions. It became a central gathering point, a place where the collective found unity, not merely for sustenance and planning, but for reflection and imaginative thought. During those hushed hours, with the day's perils receding and the night stretching out in silent vastness, they shared their accounts. Some were straightforward recollections of successful hunts and arduous treks. Others delved into different realms, offering explanations for the inexplicable. Words were crafted to imbue meaning into a world that remained far too extensive to fully grasp. The wind was no longer just a movement of air, it carried whispers. The celestial lights were not merely distant points, they became watchful presences. The earth, the watercourses, the creatures that inhabited the land, they were more than simple resources. They were vital, potent, and mysterious forces. And in speaking of them, humans conveyed a mixture of deference, apprehension, and thankfulness. These nascent understandings did not originate from codified texts or imposed directives. They arose from the fire's glow, from the palpable pressure of their surroundings, compelling them to discover a method of existence without being overwhelmed. It was within the luminescence of those flames that rituals took form. A successful hunter might offer a silent tribute to the spirit of the creature he had felled. A mother might extend her hand towards the heavens before embarking on a lengthy journey, seeking a safe passage. Certain communities inscribed symbolic markings upon stones or their own flesh, emblems imbued with significance, even if the underlying rationale remained elusive. These actions transcended mere habit. They represented an endeavor to impose structure upon a realm that was untamed and inherently uncertain. The fire itself ascended to a position of sanctity. It repelled the encroaching darkness, thawed chilled extremities, and deterred predatory threats. Without its presence, the night was an abyss. With it, hope flickered. Allowing the fire to extinguish was unthinkable. Its light was synonymous with life. Consequently, it was tended with meticulous care, almost reverence. Someone was perpetually watchful, ensuring its sustenance. From their earliest steps, children learned that fire embodied more than just survival. It was a force demanding profound respect. Life's complexities grew with each passing cycle of seasons. When tempests ravaged the landscape, when game disappeared without forewarning, or when illness afflicted the community, these occurrences were not random. They were interpreted as signals. Perhaps the spirits were displeased, or perhaps they were subjecting the community to a trial. Regardless of the interpretation, the fire became the focal point for vocalizing these queries, a place where individuals sought solace, not just from the chill, but from the assurance of a benevolent, overarching presence. Around the flames, the elders assumed roles extending beyond the custodians of remembrance. They became the articulators of these foundational beliefs. They recounted epochs when existence was more arduous, of hunts, triumphs against overwhelming odds, of unusual celestial phenomena, or of prescient dreams. Their pronouncements held considerable weight, for they were not mere anecdotes. They were the threads binding the collective to something far greater than their individual existences. For the younger generations, these narratives served as instructive lessons. They absorbed not only the practicalities of locating sustenance or tracking game, but also the approach to perceiving the world as their forebears had, alive, potent, and brimming with meaning. They learned to show reverence before embarking on a hunt, to offer the initial portion of meat to the fire, or to etch a simple protective sign in the earth before retiring for the night. To them, these rituals were not baseless superstitions, but an integral aspect of survival, interwoven with their core beliefs. Even the departed were not consigned to oblivion. Interments evolved beyond a mere measure to conceal the scent from predators. Resting places were marked with stones, and the deceased were laid to rest, accompanied by their tools, weaponry, or adornments, as if they would require these in an afterlife. This practice was not solely an expression of sorrow, but also of hope. The hope that existence did not cease within the cold earth, and that those who had passed continued to exist somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight. As the communities migrated across the terrestrial expanse, these convictions accompanied them. They underwent shifts and transformations much like the capricious wind, yet the fire remained a constant. Irrespective of their location, be it a frozen tundra, a dense woodland, or the precipice of a thunderous ocean, they converged around its warmth. And within its glow, they reaffirmed their connection to a reality transcending the immediate demands of hunger and apprehension that characterized their daily lives. These nascent beliefs furnished humanity with a resilience that provisions and shelter alone could never bestow. They transmuted the unknown into something manageable, imparted significance to suffering, purpose to ceremonial acts, and solace to those who had experienced loss. And although no empirical proof existed for the spiritual entities in the wind or the voices within the fire, their accepted reality was paramount. Belief itself served as a vital implement, as indispensable as any spear or scraping tool. It maintained the cohesion of communities when the world seemed intent on fracturing them. It instilled the courage to venture into the unknown, to confront the frigid, and to persevere even when the horizon appeared boundless. Eventually, as humankind developed the capacity to perceive the world not solely through the lenses of hunger and peril, but also through the prism of meaning and aspiration, they stood prepared for the subsequent monumental shift. For the very fire that warmed their hands and illuminated their narratives would, in time, flicker beside the initial sown seeds, heralding the genesis of something even grander than mere survival. The fires continued to burn, the hunts sustained the communities, and the ebb and flow of the seasons dictated every decision. Yet incrementally, a subtle transformation began to manifest. For countless generations, humans had lived by adapting to the world's rhythms, following the migrating herds, gathering whatever the land offered, and departing when its bounty diminished. However, as their manual dexterity improved and their cognitive abilities sharpened, they started to question whether survival had to be perpetually linked to the chase. It commenced with keen observation. While foraging, they noted that certain flora thrived where seeds had previously fallen. A cluster of berries that yielded abundantly in one season often reappeared in the subsequent year, not through random chance, but as a consequence of nature's cyclical repetition. They observed that animals not only left imprints on the soil, but also on the vegetation they disturbed, scattering seeds that germinated in their wake. These were minor details, yet they were precisely the kind of minutiae that humans retained. Initially, it was not cultivation in the structured sense, but rather gentle encouragement. After consuming fruits, they would discard the seeds near their encampments, and over time, they witnessed some of these seeds germinate. When they discovered a locale abundant with nuts or tubers, they would return repeatedly, learning its cycles, subtly protecting it, even deterring fauna that might strip it bare. They were not yet planting deliberately, but they were beginning to subtly influence the environment without conscious intent. The transition from stone to seed was not abrupt. It unfolded gradually across innumerable seasons and diverse communities, each contributing a modest increment to the knowledge imparted around the fire. They discerned that if a patch of vegetation was not overharvested, it would regenerate with greater vigor the following year. They understood that scattering seeds in the soil near their camps could yield sustenance closer to their dwellings. What had once been the caprice of nature was evolving into a deliberate act, and with it, the fragile beginnings of agriculture took root. This represented more than an innovative method of procuring food. It signified a new cognitive paradigm. Hunting and gathering necessitated continuous movement. Cultivation demanded patience, requiring a sustained presence in a single location long enough to witness the growth of crops. For the first time, humans were compelled to envision a future extending beyond a single day or week, reaching months ahead. They had to strategize for a harvest they would not witness until the seasons had turned. Fire, tools, and the solidarity of the community had instilled in them the capacity for endurance. Seeds, however, taught them the art of waiting. And in that period of anticipation, the world began to transform. As humans dispersed seeds and returned to the same land parcels, their encampments gradually became more established. Dwellings grew more robust, and hearths were rebuilt in identical locations, their stones darkened by years of accumulated smoke. Communities that had once been nomadic wanderers began to establish a more settled presence. The initial indicators of habitation emerged not from a conscious decision, but from the subtle allure of the land itself. The animal kingdom also began to adapt. Certain species, such as wild goats and sheep, gravitated towards human settlements to scavenge discarded food or graze in cleared areas. Initially, they were mere opportunists, but over time, humans recognized the advantage of their proximity. A solitary animal provided sustenance, but a herd represented security. They began to guide, protect, and even enclose them, thereby transforming the act of hunting into something fundamentally different, a symbiotic relationship between predator and prey that would irrevocably alter the global landscape. However, even in these nascent stages, cultivation was not without its inherent risks. An unfavorable season could decimate a crop before it matured. Pests could ravage the land, rendering it barren. Storms could flatten entire fields in a single night. While hunting had its dangers, it at least offered immediate resolutions, either successful capture or the prospect of hunger. Seeds, however, necessitated faith and trust in the unseen. Yet the potential rewards were undeniable. A single successful harvest translated into a food supply that could be preserved for months rather than spoiling within days. It meant less arduous travel, fewer desperate hunts, and consequently, more time for other pursuits, the refinement of tools, the construction of shelters, and even those quiet interludes around the fire where humans shared their stories and contemplated future possibilities. The transition from stone to seed, though gradual, was irreversible. Each succeeding generation contributed incrementally to the knowledge inherited from the previous one, until, without any deliberate intention, they crossed a significant threshold. They were no longer merely surviving at the whim of the natural world. They were beginning to shape it. And as they pressed seeds into the earth and observed the emergence of the first verdant shoots, a new sense of belonging also began to flourish alongside them. They were no longer simply hunters or wanderers. They were evolving into something more: settlers, builders, and custodians of the land. The world that had once propelled them relentlessly forward was beginning to hold them in place. And for the first time in human history, it appeared plausible that the untamed wilderness might no longer dictate their destiny. Nevertheless, even as this new way of life took root, they carried with them the vestiges of all that had preceded it: the enduring fire, the refined tools, the rich tapestry of stories, the unbreakable bonds of the community, and the remembrance of countless ages spent in pursuit of the world rather than its deliberate shaping. For no matter how deeply the initial seeds were sown, the resonance of those earlier eras would never truly depart from them. The first seeds were sown, the fires blazed throughout the night, and the communities remained in one locale for extended periods, unprecedented in their history. However, even as humans began to mold the land, they carried with them the indelible memories of every step that had led them to this point. The echoes of the Stone Age were not discarded. They persisted within the hands that fashioned dwellings, the eyes that scanned the distant horizon, and the innate responses ingrained through millennia of survival. Those echoes resided within the fire, still diligently guarded as if it possessed a living essence. Although humans no longer experienced the same level of apprehension regarding the night, they continued to congregate around its warmth, drawn by its persistent allure. the same comfort and solace that had brought their ancestors together when predators lurked just beyond the visible perimeter. The fire was no longer solely a means of protection, it was a repository of memory, a quiet testament to an era when existence hinged upon a single, unwavering flame. They were also present within the tools. A smoothed blade or a perfectly crafted hammer was more than a mere fragment of stone or metal. It was the lineal descendant of those initial rocks, struck together in the enveloping darkness. Every refinement embodied the accumulated wisdom of prior generations, each sharpened edge a direct link to the first human who recognized the transformative power of a sharp stone. The echo persisted in the very manner in which humans navigated the landscape. Even as they established permanent settlements and constructed homes, they continued to tread established routes, follow river courses, traverse valleys, and consult the celestial sphere for indications of seasonal change. Though they had learned the art of cultivation, they never lost the ability to interpret the earth, the stars, and the wind. The ingrained instincts of the hunter-gatherer remained evident in every movement. They were palpable within the narratives recounted by the firelight. Long before the advent of inscribed clay tablets or ink-adorned parchment, there were spoken words. The elders recounted tales of the hunt, of storms successfully weathered, of magnificent creatures that once roamed the earth. These were not merely historical accounts. They constituted an inheritance. Within each narrative, the living perpetuated the legacy of the departed, their knowledge and their struggles interwoven into the very fabric of the community. Perhaps most significantly, those echoes endured within the interpersonal connections. The community represented the foundational and most enduring verity of human existence. Without its collective strength, no fire could have been sustained, no hunt successfully concluded, no child nurtured. Even as humans erected villages and, eventually, cities, they carried this inherent need for association with them. They were intrinsically designed for communal survival, shaped by a world that necessitated unity, and this fundamental lesson was never forgotten. The Stone Age was not merely a historical period, it was the bedrock upon which human identity was built. The patience cultivated through planting seeds, the vigilance honed by observing the night, the courage forged in confronting formidable predators, and the collaborative spirit born from the community, all of these became integral components of our being. Even now, in an era illuminated by countless artificial light sources and protected by structures beyond the imagination of our ancestors, those echoes persist. When we gather around a fire, share a meal, gaze upon the stars, or engage in storytelling late into the night, we are replicating the actions of our predecessors. We are not separate from them. We are their continuing legacy. The Stone Age may have concluded, but it has never truly vanished. It resides within our innate responses, in the subconscious inclination of our minds towards the simple interplay of flame and shadow, in our inherent need for belonging, and in the quiet certainty that our existence is a testament to the endurance of those who came before us. And if you listen intently, beyond the clamor of the present, past the imposing structures and the hum of contemporary life, you can almost discern them: the sound of stones colliding, the crackle of the initial fire, the distant calls of a hunt, the hushed voices of individuals huddled together beneath the vast canopy of stars, communicating in a language predating articulate speech. Those echoes have never diminished. They are present within each of us, serving as a reminder of our origins and the immense journey we have undertaken. And though the world has undergone a radical transformation, that fundamental truth remains. We are the progeny of the Stone Age, shaped by its trials, propelled forward by its lessons, and still navigating the enduring influence of our ancestors' fires. Thus, from the first ember of fire to the nascent sowing of seeds, from the chipped stones to the whispered tales by the fireside, the path of survival unfolded across innumerable generations. Every stride, every lesson learned, and every indelible mark borne by those who preceded us has culminated in this present moment. We are their descendants, the ones who learned to stand firm in the darkness without succumbing to fear, because someone, at some point, ignited a flame. We are the ones capable of construction, discourse, and imagination, because communities once convened to share their collective wisdom in the fire's embrace. The world we inhabit, characterized by its security, comfort, and certainty, emerged from their relentless struggle against an environment that offered no concessions. Yet, their resonance, though subtle, remains unbroken. We continue to orient ourselves towards the heavens. We still gather around the luminescence of a fire, even if it no longer serves as our sole bulwark. We continue to recount narratives, though our accounts are now inscribed rather than etched into collective memory. Beneath the entirety of our creations, there persists something more ancient, something that rightfully belongs to them. The Stone Age was not merely a distant historical epoch, it was the genesis of all that followed. It endowed us with hands for crafting, voices for sharing, minds for envisioning, and a fundamental imperative to unite against the unknown. It shaped us in ways that time itself cannot efface. And perhaps, upon reflection, we have never truly moved beyond its influence. The fire may now burn with greater intensity, the tools may be more refined, and the seeds may flourish in cultivated fields rather than in wild terrains. But the same fundamental human heart beats within us, carrying the enduring memory of those who persevered when survival was the sole, paramount objective. The next time you find yourself in a moment of quietude, observing the gentle radiance of a flame, or feeling the subtle pull of the nocturnal sky, remember them. Remember the hands that shaped the earliest implements, the voices that recounted the inaugural narratives, and the eyes that gazed upon a world far vaster and considerably more formidable than our own, yet resolutely refused to avert their gaze. We are here because they endured, and their chronicle, in every significant aspect, is intrinsically our own.